Something also changed in the Haredi community, which is the Haredi community was very comfortable as individuals with the fact that the army didn't want them. Like, you don't want us, we also don't want you, so everybody's happy. It's like a shidduch where both people are happy breaking up. Everybody goes home with a smile.
Right.
And it worked well for everybody. And after October 7th, like I said, the Hamas, the feeling was that Hamas is not being selective. They're not coming to kill. This is another Holocaust.
Yeah.
And they're not coming to kill only secular Jews. They're coming to kill everybody. And therefore, we want to be part. There was a certain kiruv levavot that happened in the Haredi community. It was more at the periphery, but it could have become a real phenomena, a real social phenomena of we want to be part of this, not because you want to make us be part of this, but because we want to be part of this.
Right.
So there was, at the same time that the defense ministry that suddenly became open, there was a tremendous push in the Haredi world, especially many older men that had left yeshiva years ago, but had never gone to the army, so they weren't eligible for miluim, said, we want to be in miluim. We want to leave our wives and children and go away for a couple of months and fight for the state of Israel. What ended up breaking it, Chashmonaim now is basically a failed unit. What ended up breaking it was the miluim is sort of holding its own, maybe, partially. The sadir, the part that was supposed to be part of the regular army, has crashed and burned. It's not really a thing anymore. What really broke it was the draft law. When Lieberman and Lapid, basically, and obviously all the other politicians that agree with them, came forth with, we need 100% participation, we need shivyon benetel, everybody's going to be drafted, etc. It just became toxic in the Haredi community to go to the army. They had a platoon that was supposed to start with 140 soldiers, started with 40 soldiers because at the last minute 100 said, if there's a draft law, we're not coming. And they dropped out.
Sababa, where life takes a spin. Join the fun, let the talk begin.
Hello and welcome after a very long hiatus to another episode of Hakol Sababa podcast. I have with me Dr. Yechiel Reit, who is one of my certified interesting people from around the neighborhood. I hope that's a good way to introduce you. But what I'd like to hear is from yourself, like what is your background and what do you specialize in? What are your specific interests?
Okay. I moved here around 20 years ago when the neighborhood was still a very young neighborhood.
So I beat you by 3 years then.
And my children were relatively young. My oldest at that time was 12, 13, something like that. And continued to work in the States because physician salaries in this country are challenging.
So when you say you were working in the States, you were doing telemedicine?
No, I traveled. I was, there's rough numbers, a month at home, a month at work, a month at home, a month at work. And when I was at work, basically, all I did was work. I would work 5-6 shifts a week, which is considered a pretty heavy load for emergency medicine. So I was basically working the equivalent of full-time, but doing it every other month.
Right.
And so I was able to earn a relatively decent living. Certainly by Israeli standards, it was a decent living. And try to pay off some of my debts and be able to buy a house. Like, we moved here with no money for a down payment. And, so we bought the house 100% on mortgage. I won't go into how we did that, but so things were financially okay for a while. Then COVID came along, and it became impossible to travel. Flights were being canceled all over the place, and you were like 2 weeks of isolation when you landed. So it meant, if you're home for a month and 2 of those weeks you couldn't leave your room, it was not really practical. So that's when I stopped traveling, and I began working at a hospital here in Israel, and the emergency department. And I'm very happy there. I shouldn't say that. It's a very stressful job. I very much like the people. So I'm happy in terms of the social work, the social part of the work environment. The work part of the work environment is more stressful definitely much more stressful than working in the United States. You're working with much less resources. Some of it is particular to the hospital that I'm working at, but some of it is also just the medical system in general in this country. Also, emergency medicine has not yet matured as a profession in this country. So there are a lot of professional challenges in terms of that. But it's okay. Whatever. I deal with it. And I took about a 75% pay cut, something like that.
Wow.
After COVID, my second son got injured, and I had to be home for a while because of that. Now, theoretically, I guess I could start traveling again, but I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. And what's your involvement with the army?
So when I first moved here, even before I moved here, I actually knew a lot of people in the Chel Refuah, the medical corps in the army. When I was a resident in the United States, one of the requirements for graduating residency was to do either a research project or an educational project. There were a couple of different ways you could fulfill the requirement, and they gave you a month to work on it. And I took that month and actually came to Israel, spent the month in Israel, and worked on a teaching project that the hospital had developed. It was sort of taking the concept of the way trauma care is standardized in the United States. There's a program owned by the American College of Surgeons called ATLS, Acute Trauma Life Support. And it's based on, it's been updated many, many times over the years, and it's based on resources and organizational type environment that's typical of the United States or countries that have a similar medical system. And people in the residency where I worked tried to rework the ATLS program to make it something that could also be used, or in a slightly different format, be used in countries with much fewer resources and where medicine was organized in a very different way. And they took the project to Vietnam. They took the project to various countries in Central and South America, and translated into Vietnamese and translated into Spanish. And I brought it to Israel, translated into Hebrew. The Israeli hospitals don't really need such a thing and weren't really interested in such a thing because of their system is close enough to what exists in the United States that they would see no reason to modify it. There were people in the army that were interested, and there were a lot of people in pre-hospital care and the various Hatzalah networks and whatnot that were very interested, and that's who we brought it to. Mm-hmm. Talking early 2000s, when there were still Jews living in Gaza, the Jewish communities there. And so I brought it to the Hatzalahs of those communities there. They were probably the people who were most interested in that because they were in an environment where they had a fairly heavy trauma burden on the one hand. On the other hand, there were no local hospitals.
What is the closest hospital?
It depends where in Gaza you are, but there is Barzilai in Ashkelon, which is a little bit closer. At that time, Barzilai has since been rebuilt, but talking the early 2000s, Barzilai was not a major trauma center, I don't think. So Soroka in Beersheba, which is quite a distance. Again, when evacuations are done by helicopter, it's less of an issue, but it's not always available for various reasons. And they, unfortunately, in Gaza had a lot of mass casualty incidents where you couldn't, at least in the short run, be able to get enough helicopters quickly enough.
What, from terrorist attacks?
Yeah, a lot of terrorist attacks in Gaza at that time. Not all that different than today. So they were very interested in it. There was a physician, there was only one physician who lived in the communities, the Jewish communities in Gaza. And although he had initially been trained in family practice, he took on a tremendous amount of trauma responsibilities and became quite an expert in the subject and field care. So he was very interested. That was one of the main places that I took it to. And then there were other places in Ayosh. that were interested. And like I said, there were people in the Army that were more interested in a theoretical way. The Army had plenty of resources. It wasn't a resource-poor environment, but they were interested in being able to change the way people thought about trauma care in the field as opposed to in the hospital.
Just to clarify, the term you used, Ayosh, is Aza, Yehuda, V'Shomron.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I think they used to call it Yesha.
Right, Yehuda, Shomron, Aza.
Yeah.
And then when Aza was, the Jews were expelled from Aza,
So
they changed it
Yosh.
to Yosh, basically. So I knew people in the Army from then, people that I had met. I kept up with them. And when I moved to Israel 20 years ago, the Army is always short on physicians, and they have a particular liking for emergency medicine physicians because it's
The nature
a
of the
type
work,
of training that lends itself very much to the interests of the medical corps of the Army. They asked me to draft, even though theoretically I was old enough that I could have opted out of the draft. At that time, I think the draft for physicians was up to 31 or 32 years old, and I was, I think, 38. So I could have opted out. Also, I had 5 children, but I had my 6th child within a few months of moving here. So, no, I take that back. I had 4 children when I came. My 5th child within a few months of moving here. I think you can opt out of Miluim when you have 6 children. So that at the time that I was drafted, I actually didn't have 6 children, but I could have aged out.
Right.
But I chose not to. I sort of liked a lot of things I like about the Army. And I, in terms of that, I have no regrets. The Army's been good to me, and I always say it's like camping with guns, and I enjoy that. People pay a lot of money to go sleep in the wilderness in a tent, and I get to do it at somebody else's expense.
That's fun. Yeah. Okay. So now what?
So that was about, I don't remember exactly, 16, 17 years ago. I became a battalion physician for an reserve infantry battalion. I also became involved somewhat with Netzach Yehuda, which was otherwise known as the Nachal Haredi. Not necessarily from the military aspect, more from the aspect of I don't know how you would call it in English, the Amuta. What do you call that?
The organization, the non-profit organization.
Right, which provides a lot of the support that goes around the matefet. I don't know how you would call that in English either.
Envelope?
Literally, that's what it means. But the envelope, because Netzach Yehuda has a lot of unique needs and a lot of a unique way of being in the Army. So it has a very strong matefet around it. So I was more involved with that.
Support infrastructure are we talking about?
Yeah, and I used to go very often to bases for Shabbos, and even when I wasn't in the Miluim, just as a civilian, spend Shabbos with my children on the base with the soldiers. My children enjoyed it very much. Soldiers, at least some of them, used to enjoy it. I enjoyed it. My wife did not like it, so we used to go without my wife. She stayed home by herself. And so, we traveled around various places that we went, and my children have nice memories of doing those things. And I did my annual reserve duty in my Gdud. Occasionally, when they needed somebody for other battalions for various reasons in the same area which is basically the northern Shomron, that my Gdud was assigned to, I would offer, or be offered, I guess, to help out. So I served as a battalion physician for some other battalions just because for whatever reason they didn't have a physician. And then I did a little work on the Golan during the time when they were medically helping the rebels against the Assad government. I wasn't in the field hospital there, but I was one of the physicians who did evacuations to Israeli hospitals from Syria. Various other little things. Until the war broke out 2 years ago. And then, the famous expression, it's all fun and games until someone loses an eye.
Yeah.
So the Army was all fun and games until it became a real war.
Yeah.
I can't say that I have any regrets, but I've certainly been in many difficult places and difficult circumstances and seen some pretty horrendous things.
What was your involvement around October 7th time?
I happened to have been in the army anyway then because my involvement in Netzach Yehuda. Netzach Yehuda didn't have a physician, and so the paramedic that was filling in place of a physician in Netzach Yehuda had been soger all of the chagim. In other words, he had not been able to go home for any of the holidays. He was there Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, first day Sukkot, and he, sort of demanded that they let him go home for Simchas Torah. Because usually you get every other holiday off or something, and he hadn't been able to get anything off. And so they asked me if I would come and fill in for him for 4 days, 2 days before Simchas Torah, 2 days after, and I agreed to do that. So they called me up to Miluim. I was in Netzach Yehuda at that time. Was on the Golan Heights. Not anticipating. So calm and laid back was it, and so the attitude was so peacetime. That it's an infantry battalion, and in theory, as soon as I came there, I should have gone to the armory and signed out a rifle. That's pretty standard issue thing in an infantry
even for
battalion.
the physician.
Oh, for sure, yeah. There is in international law some issues with whether or not medical personnel should be considered combat soldiers, etc. But the opponents that we face here in Israel deliberately try to kill medical personnel. That's we actually very often, our vehicles will cover over the markings that mark them as medical vehicles because they become specifically targets.
Right, there's the other side
being marked.
Marks the military vehicles as ambulances.
Maybe. So we did. The medical personnel all have to be armed and are considered combatants and are expected to be trained to combat standards and expected to be able to defend themselves and etc. But I'm saying so pretty standard thing in an infantry battalion. First thing you get there when you arrive, you're a reservist to sign out a rifle from the armory. But I went to the person who was in charge of the base. The battalion commander wasn't there because he had also taken off for the Chag. So whoever was in charge of the base in his place, and I said to him, listen, the guy who's going to be coming, that I'm replacing, he's going to come back 2 days after Simchas Torah in the evening, and the army's probably going to be closed, and I'll have to get somebody to reopen it so I can return the rifle and etc. And it's going to be a big hassle for me. Do you mind if I just don't sign out a rifle? And he was like, sure, no problem. Nothing ever happens here. Nobody really cares. Oh, God.
Until it does, yeah.
But that was sort of...
That was the attitude.
That was sort of the level of what people were expecting. And of course, we woke up Simchas Torah morning and things were a little bit different. Yeah. And then by Simchas Torah afternoon, my regular battalion, here I was just doing a favor, but my regular battalion was called up. And I had to leave, and the paramedic had to come back from home for the one holiday that he had finally gotten off, and etc. And since then I was in the war. Mostly in the northern Shomron, Jenin, Tulkarem, the villages all around that area, which was, in the beginning of the war, very violent. It was not as bad as Gaza, but it was a real war. And then later things calmed down there. I did go to Gaza for a period of time as well. That's what I spent the war doing. About 2 months. So basically I spent almost the entire 2 years in the army. Even when my battalion wasn't, my battalion did 3 rounds of being mobilized. But even when they weren't mobilized, actually 4 rounds. But even when they weren't mobilized, I helped out with other battalions. So I basically stayed in the war straight through. I got out 2 months ago. And it's very strange. By now, 2 months later, it's like a distant memory. I vaguely know that I was in the war, but it's not real or live or anything anymore. Which is good, because I think, the people who keep it with them, it becomes too much part of their lives. Those are the people who end up getting PTSD and stuff like that. And people who have poor memories and forget everything are less vulnerable to that.
That's fortunate. So let's do a big context shift over here, because the reason why we're here and why I specifically wanted to talk to you is because I was fascinated by your talk that you gave a couple of weeks ago about the Haredi approach to the army and attitudes to the army. And in between then and now, I also came across your little booklet called Applied Monotheism. which that was a great hook of a title. I looked at that and thought, wow, that's interesting. And then I saw the author, and I thought, oh, I know you, and started reading it in shul until the owner took it back and said, I like this.
You can order your own copy.
Thank you. Yes, I probably will. And then last night you also started a new series on the history of Haredism and whatever. And we won't have time on this podcast to get the full history, but perhaps you can give us a bit of a précis of like what exactly is the definition of Haredi Judaism. There's it's a lot of stuff bandied about it. Like, is it somebody who wears black and white? Is that the definition, or is there something more to it? Or what are is it monolithic? Are there different little sectors inside, and what is the common thread?
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent question. Most of the people who write about this, at least in academia, but also in the media, and I think in common parlance, use it as a sociological term. In other words, people that look a certain way, speak a certain way, they consider Haredim. The problem with the sociological term is it's very inaccurate, and it doesn't work. In the sense that, and this is sort of like inside baseball type of definition, but Satmar is Haredi, Ponevezh is Haredi, Lakewood is Haredi, Lubavitch is Haredi. They have almost no common language between those four. Maybe Lakewood and Ponevezh talk to each other a little bit. Even that's, they're really culturally very, very different. But these other
I did hear this morning that there's that the Ponevezh yeshiva has a chabura in Tanya.
It could be. There's many people outside of Lubavitch that study Tanya. Yeah. Tanya was fairly widely accepted. Again, in the yeshiva world, the Nefesh HaChaim was much more accepted. But still, Tanya was still considered a respectable opponent for the Nefesh HaChaim.
Yeah.
Okay? An honorable opponent, to say.
Yes.
So that doesn't surprise me, but I don't think there are a lot of Lubavitch Chassidim in Ponevezh.
Yeah.
Or in Lakewood, for that. In the yeshiva, in BMG. I'm not talking about the city of Lakewood,
yes,
but at BMG, I don't think there are a lot of Lubavitch Chassidim. And there's a reason for that. And then if you add, I just took all groups of, pretty mainstream Ashkenazim. But you could take a group like Breslov Ananachs. Are they Haredi? They're very, very different. And you have Sfardim from Porat Yosef, who would definitely consider themselves, are they Haredi? And in the United States, you don't have a real Yekka community in the Haredi world here. But in the United States, you have a Yekka community that considers itself Haredi. So are they Haredim? And all of these people live very, very different lifestyles. And the way you can, a good way to mark the difference between them, in biology, the way they mark the difference between species is if they can reproduce together. Right? So if two animals can't reproduce together, then they're separate species.
Right.
And then you have sort of things on the border, like a horse and a donkey that can produce a mule, but the mule itself can't produce anything. Yes. Right? It's sterile. So long term they can't reproduce.
How does that translate into? Humans biologically can obviously.
So culturally, you sort of have the same thing as do these groups intermarry? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you can imagine a family from Ponevezh and a family from Lakewood perhaps intermarrying, but let's say a family from Satmar and a family from Lubavitch are not going to intermarry, like 0%, right? And even Ponevezh and Satmar, it's going to be 0%. And Porat Yosef and Ponevezh is going to be 0%. So these are groups that don't intermarry, so in a certain sense they're different. The reason they don't intermarry is because they really have such different lifestyles that they really are incompatible with each other. So then how do they become one group? Like, how do they go under one heading? So that's the real problem with the sociological definition, is you're talking about people that are very different than each other in almost all ways. So what does unite them then? And so to me, the idea is that what unites them is ideology. And that's sort of the point of the book that I wrote in Applied Monotheism, that's its central thesis, is that there are essentially two different ways to be a religious person. This is probably not unique to Judaism, but because I'm Jewish and that's sort of what I'm interested in, I talk about it from a Jewish perspective. There are essentially two different ways of being religious. One is that you believe that religion, whatever the fundamental belief of your religion is the center of reality, and everything else in reality is sort of spokes coming off that center. So the rest of reality is sort of the wheel that surrounds that central core. And nothing else has any meaning or existence except for the fact that it surrounds that core.
Right.
Okay? The other way of being religious is to be religious as an affectation. In other words, there are many people in the world that are fans of a particular sports team.
Yeah.
But it doesn't define who they are.
And then you have those who...
Maybe, but I'm saying more reasonable people, more mature people. It doesn't define who they are. It's something you do.
Yeah.
But let's say, imagine if someone's a physician and he's a sports fan, the particular team that he's a fan of should not define the way he practices medicine.
Right. He's not going to refuse
shouldn't
to
necessarily
treat a fan
define
of the opposing team.
or even his attitude towards medicine in general, the meaning of it, right? Or the responsibility of it shouldn't be defined by the team that he's a fan of. And the same thing regarding how he raises his children, and the same thing regarding how he makes economic decisions in his own life, etc. And there are many people who practice religion in that way, that it's sort of, I'm a fan of this particular team, I'm a fan of this particular religion, it's something that I do, may even be meaningful to me, and I may even mean it sincerely, but it's just one of the things that I do. It doesn't control everything else that I do. The other things that I do them as if they are independent factors.
Right.
So these are two very different attitudes towards what religion means.
Yeah.
I would say that in the West, post-Enlightenment, which obviously Enlightenment had a very strong anti-clerical element to it, so post-Enlightenment in the West, it's become much more respectable for religion to be sort of an affectation. And when you think about something, let's say, like the Constitution of the United States, which separated religion and state, that the federal government can't have any established religion, etc. So you could think of that as a very pragmatic thing, that they looked at what had happened in Europe over the 200-300 years before them, particularly in Central Europe, how so many countries like Germany and Austria had become poverty-ridden by the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War and the damage to France because of the struggles between the Huguenots and the Protestants. And they just said to themselves, listen, no one ever wins these wars, because even if you win at this generation, the next generation, the other religion rises again and then they win and whatever. So no one ever wins these wars. They destroy economies. They kill a lot of people. This is just pragmatically not a worthwhile thing to get involved in. So we, when we're founding a new country, are going to put in the Constitution for purely pragmatic reasons that the government will not take a position on religion, so that the government will never get involved in these wars. And that's a reasonable argument. But there are many people who understand it very differently. They understand it as an ideal, not as a pragmatic thing, like, because no one ever wins these wars and because they destroy the economy, so let's just avoid it. But this is actually how a person ought to be. Even if you could win the wars, and even if the economy would flourish during these wars, and even if nobody got killed in these wars, you shouldn't be fighting over religion, because religion, like sports, is something that you do. It's a personal matter. It shouldn't affect other areas of your life. So you shouldn't have any reason why you want to fight with the people of the next city that have a different religion. During most of history, that attitude was considered a sign of being very insincere in your religiosity, and a negative thing. But with the rise of the Enlightenment, that sort of became an ideal. And that spread to a certain extent to Judaism. So there are Jews who see religion as the meaning of reality, and everything else that they engage in, and everything else that happens in the world, is a spoke coming off, a spoke that is part of the great wheel, but that comes out of this center, this one pinnacle of the pyramid, which in the case of Judaism is monotheism. And everything radiates out from that, and everything has meaning only because of that. And that, I define that as Haredism. I don't define it. I think Haredim define that as Haredism. That is sort of the self-identification of how Haredim see themselves. And then all the other people in the world that could be practicing Jews and keeping all the mitzvahs of the Torah, etc., but they're doing it as a personal affectation. But I also have other things in my life that I do that are unrelated. They're not Haredim.
So according to this definition that you're saying, then you'd have a very large sector of the Dati Leumi community who would fall into Haredi under that definition.
That is true, and they call themselves Haredim. That's why they're called Chardal, Haredi Dati Leumi, precisely because they've taken on that identity. That's precisely what they appreciate about themselves, that we are Zionists and we are nationalists, but our Zionism and our nationalism are only spokes in that larger wheel. We see our entire reality as focused on and rotating around this central reality, which I'll call monotheism. You can call it Judaism, whatever you want to call it, and that's why they call themselves Haredi Dati Leumi. Right.
Okay. So then, I think it's important to make that that semantic distinction that because the use of the term Haredi or ultra orthodox, as the English or non-Jewish world refers to them, is there's a kind of a Venn diagram over here of what the world refers to as Haredi and what your definition of Haredi is over here.
I think that is true. Like I said, I think that most of the time in popular parlance, when we talk about Haredim, it's used as a sociological term.
Yeah.
I think when it's used that way, it's very imprecise because you have no clear definition of exactly who you're referring to, and you're referring to many different conflicting things to whom the things you're saying. When you want to say Haredim are a certain way or Haredim believe a certain thing, it'll almost always not be true.
Yes.
Because there'll be people that fall under the heading of Haredi in the sociological definition who don't believe that thing, or who don't do that thing, or whatever it is that you're saying. And that's, I guess maybe because I'm a physician, I have this sort of bias towards like scientific definitions that are very precise and true in all circumstances. And if it's not true in all circumstances, it's not a correct definition. So I am looking for, I guess you'd say, a more scientific definition.
Right.
But I also think it's the way that Haredim self-defined. If you look at the people that formulated the term of Haredi, which probably goes back to the Haredis, going back to the early 1900s, what they were trying to express was precisely this, that we don't have nationalism and Judaism. To us, nationalism is either an expression of Judaism or it's illegitimate. But there's no such thing as having two different values, nationalism and Judaism. Right. And they were using that to differentiate themselves from those Jews who they saw as having both Judaism and nationalism as two separate values.
Right, and that I can see that would be a fundamental clash with the early Zionists, who were doing it as not, and certainly not l'shem shamayim, certainly not.
But it wasn't so much actually meant against secular Zionism. It was meant to differentiate themselves from religious Zionism. Because secular Zionism had nationalism but didn't have religion.
Right.
So there was no possibility of there being an overlap. They wanted to differentiate themselves from people who had religion, and yet their nationalism wasn't born of their religion, in their perspective. And incidentally, if you look at the way where the word comes from in Tanakh, which is psak towards the end of Yeshaya, that's the context in which it's used there. Which is, I think, the reason why they chose this word.
Haredim Lidvar Hashem. What's the context of the pasuk of Haredim Lidvar Hashem?
I quote it in the book. I don't want to quote it right now by heart because if I mix up a word in a pasuk, then that's not that good. So, but in the book, I quote the pasuk from Yirmiyahu and show how it's used in precisely that context in Yeshayahu, which is like I said, I think the reason why they chose that word.
Okay, but like. what year are we talking about where this word is being chosen to differentiate themselves from religious Zionists?
To the best of my knowledge, when I did a little research into this, the earliest documents that use this word as identifying a group within Judaism date back to 1919, something like that, maybe the early 1920s. I think 1919
so we're talking
is
about
first.
in Rav Kook's time.
Yeah, he was already here by then.
But was Rav Kook not Haredi?
Rav Kook certainly considered himself Haredi, and he certainly considered, I don't know if he was really a nationalist. It's probably a poor term. When we use the term nationalist, at least in English, we don't mean exactly what Rav Kook meant. But regardless of that, even if we use the term very poorly and say nationalism, to the extent that he was a nationalist, his nationalism grew out of his religious convictions.
Right.
It was to him an expression of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true as well of those who consider themselves to be his followers, which is the Chardal world.
Right. And the Merkaz HaRav and whatever. So then who are the religious Zionists that we're trying to differentiate ourselves from here?
I think people who are familiar with the sociology of groups that live in the current day Israel and with the history can easily identify it. I don't want to point a finger because I don't want it to be taken as accusing somebody of being something other than sincerely religious.
Yeah.
But I will give an example, let's say, and if he sees this podcast and you disagree with my interpretation, you're welcome to tell me, and if I am convinced that I misinterpreted what you wrote, I will change it. But the way I understand a story that's written in the book called psak, which is the biography of Elazar Stern, who was a career officer in the Israeli army.
He was a Chaver Knesset as well.
And then he became Rosh Aka, which is the head of the Manpower Directorate in the Israeli army, which is not it sounds like a very technical, bureaucratic type of position, but it's actually a position that's very competitive. Many people want it. And it's extremely powerful because it creates the ideology of the army. It creates the ideological environment of the army. So it does much more than, just sign people's paychecks.
Right.
Which was his interest in being Rosh Aka, was that he wanted to have input into the way the army thought about itself and its place in the nation, etc. And then he went on to become a Chaver Knesset, and first in one party and then in a different party and whatever. So he wrote a biography. He wrote this a couple of years ago, so I don't know, things may have changed since then, but this is how he saw himself. Psak, of course, literally is the, at least in the infantry units, there might be other units as well, but at least in the infantry, when you finish your basic training and your advanced training, so it's usually around 7 or 8 months into your army service, you do a long hike, and at the end of the hike, you come to a place where they have your ceremony, and you sort of graduate from, and you now are a member of this, whatever, and you get your beret. You switch from the basic training beret to the beret of the color of the battalion that you belong to, and you're now an equal among, how do you call it, among the soldiers in that battalion. It's in Israeli society, it marks a significant transition in a person's life. You went from being a nobody to now being a man of standing. So that's sort of why he chose that title
for the army.
Yeah, sort of, sociologically similar to a bar mitzvah. And so he describes in there a story where when I think this was in Lebanon, his unit was in Lebanon, but he was home for Shabbos when he was a more junior officer. In other words, before he became a general under Rosh Aka. And he gets called by the army on Shabbos. Okay, this is before the days when everybody has cell phones and whatever. That there had been some incident, and a soldier in his unit. I don't know at that time if he was a Magad or a Machat. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if it was his battalion or his brigade. But a soldier serving under him had been killed, and he knew the soldier's family, and they lived in a yishuv and the soldier was married, had a wife, and there was no way for him to contact her except for to get in his car and drive to that yeshuv personally, because this is a time when many people in Israel didn't have, forget about cell phones, people didn't even have phones in their homes, and if it's a religious yeshuv and there was a common phone or there was a phone in the home, they wouldn't answer it if somebody called on Shabbos. They weren't expecting any type of emergency, so there wasn't a way to contact her except for literally to be Machal Shabbos, do a Melacha D'Oraisa, get in your car and drive over there. And so the question is, should he or shouldn't he do it? And now he has a conflict, okay? On the one hand, he feels it's very harmful for her if she doesn't know right away, because she's probably, hanging out with her friends Shabbos afternoon and joking and noshing and whatever, young women whose husbands aren't around would spend Shabbos afternoon doing. And when she does find out on Motzei Shabbos, when Shabbos is over, that during this time that she was sort of hanging out with her friends and joking and whatever, her husband was dead, psychologically this would maybe be very distressing to her. So it's important that she know right away. On the other hand, there's no pikuach nefesh, there's no threat to life here. Whoever's dead is dead already, and there's nothing going to change. And when we're talking about a Melacha D'Oraisa over here, now, if somebody wanted to make a very extreme argument that he was worried she would become suicidal and her life would be endangered or whatever, I get, maybe you could, but that's not the argument he makes. The argument he makes in his book is that he was torn between the call of two different duties. As a religious person, he's called not to violate Shabbos, and by the rules of Shabbos, there's no reason to violate it here. No, there's no pikuach nefesh, there's no hesder for doing a Melacha D'Oraisa. There's no, right? And on the other hand, he's called by his responsibility as an officer in the army, his responsibility to the families of his soldiers, his responsibility to the army itself as an institution, his responsibility to the state is to go and inform her right away because that's what's best for her and that's what the state owes her and whatever. And he's torn between these two values, and eventually he decides to go and inform her, and he does. That's what he writes in the book. Now, to me, this is a classical example of someone who has two sources of meaning in his life. I'm a nationalist, and therefore, I feel therefore that my duty to my nation, to the state of Israel, and then my duty therefore to the army, has a true calling upon me outside of the field of religion. It's not a religious calling, it's a nationalist calling. And it obligates me. On the other hand, it's also, I have obligations towards my religion. And when these two come in conflict, I have to give priority to one over the other. The fact that they can come in conflict. Now, I'm not saying that within religion you can't have different values that conflict with each other, and sometimes, that's what we have poskim for, because sometimes you don't know what to give priority to this value or to that value, but those are arguments within religion. In other words, what you're saying is, in an ideal world, God wants me to do X. In an ideal world, God wants me to do Y. And I now find myself in a situation where X and Y are in conflict. I can do one only at the expense of the other. Which would God prefer that I do? And that's a halacha question. For that, you go to a psak. But here it's very different. The X is, it's clear what my religion demands of me. I have another source that demands of me a different obligation. Yeah. And the two are in conflict. And now between these two sources of obligation, which one do I choose over the other?
Right.
Okay.
And
so that to me is a classical...
And the fact that the question even arose,
right,
is it tells the
story.
And
I'm not saying this as something unique about Elazar Stern. He said this about himself in a book that he published, so I don't feel there's any lashon hara over here. I'm just telling over a story that I read from him.
Right.
But I think that it's ma'afien. In other words, it represents the attitude of a significant segment of religious Jews in Israel. Yeah. And it's also true of a significant segment of religious Jews in the United States and in other countries. There, the conflicts are not necessarily nationalism versus religion. They can be other issues versus religion. But the fact that there can be a conflict between religion and something outside of religion itself is sort of the alternative to the Haredi model.
Right. Well. And that you made that very clear in the opening chapters of Applied Monotheism, that if you're truly monotheistic and you really believe that God is the only force in the world, that everything is created by God and everything is existing inside of God, and your only purpose for living is to do the will of God, then how does anything else become a consideration? As you say, if you're looking at the world and saying, okay, I'm in a country that needs my help, and there are lots of Jews who need help, and does God want me to go into the army? Does God not want me? Now that's a good question.
Right. So there 100%. Within religion, there's certainly a lot of space in which to weigh different religious values that can sometimes come into conflict, but that's very different than weighing values of religion versus values that have their source in something other than religion.
So bringing this now together into sort of current affairs, and we have a situation in Israel where we have a block of people that we'll call this, the sociological Haredim, to distinguish them from the attitudinal Haredim, like the Merkaz HaRav people who also view the world through that lens, but act in a different way. And again, this isn't going to apply to everyone who wears black and white, but by and large, there's a massive sociological phenomenon that is characterized by things like Kollel for life being sort of an expectation. That, let me just finish the points over here. That sort of going into the workforce is tolerated more than encouraged, and certainly not into any sort of professional thing that will require you to study and get a degree or whatever. It's work, do trade work, plumber, electrician, if you can get a quick qualification, or open a shop, something like that. And just to throw all the items on the table and let you respond everything to everything over here. It's a situation that places an inordinate amount of economic burden on everyone who's not doing that, and the sort of the Kollel
and security burden in the case of people not serving in the army,
of course,
etc.
which is where we're getting to. I mean, let's just say what's the history of that? Why is there such a large block of people that has made that kind of the hill to die on?
So there is a difference between strategy and tactics.
Yeah.
But sometimes tactics take on such a large role that they become strategy in their own right. Okay? In other words, some tactical decisions, I guess the definition of, everybody uses this term, difference between strategy and tactics. The definition of strategy versus
strategy is your long-term goal, and your tactics is how you get there.
Yeah, that's true. I was using it specifically, thinking of it in a military perspective. The difference in a military, from a military perspective, what defines a particular plan as a tactical plan versus a strategic plan is a tactical plan affects the particular situation that I find myself in now.
Yeah.
A strategic plan, the effects that it has now will affect the entire conflict, entire war, let's say, from a military perspective.
Okay.
So, just a random example to people who are like history buffs, right? In terms of the conflict between Japan and the United States during World War II, from Pearl Harbor until the Battle of Midway, there were a whole bunch of different battles. And mostly the Japanese were successful. There were places where they failed. There were places where their losses were greater than their gains. But none of them affected the ability of the Japanese to continue to be on the offensive in the war.
Right.
So they were tactical battles. Some of them were tactical. Many of them were tactical victories, but some were tactical defeats. But they didn't change the overall picture of the war. And then the Battle of Midway changed the total picture of the war, because after that, the Japanese Navy, which was, since this was a war across an ocean, the Navy was the most important aspect, could no longer go on the offensive in a meaningful way. And they would go on to have other tactical victories afterwards in Guadalcanal and whatnot, but from Midway on, it was clear that they could never win the war. It was just a question of, could they minimize how badly they lost? Okay. So, although there wasn't anything inherently different about the Battle of Midway versus, let's say, the Battle of the Coral Sea or various other battles that had taken place, the effects were very different, because the other battles didn't change the outcome of the war. They only changed the outcome of the particular battle versus midway changes the entire outcome of the war. Like I said, sometimes things that are tactical, which means they're really a very local issue, can take on significance because they will affect everything else that makes them strategic. And I'll give you an example of what I mean here. The idea of higher education. By higher education, I mean basically college, maybe graduate, etc. There's nothing in Judaism that's opposed to higher education per se. There is a question of Bittul Torah, there's a question of Sfarim Chitzonim. I mean, there are issues. I won't pretend that there are no issues whatsoever. But by and large, the vast majority, over the years, the vast majority of great Jewish scholars of the Gedolim that we look up to, going from the times of the Tanam and Amoraim through the Rishonim, might have been a little bit different in Germany and France, although it wasn't as different as people think it was, but certainly in Spain and Italy and the Middle East, Bavel, etc. Engaged in knowing what was the secular knowledge of their time. Sometimes for pragmatic reasons, they needed it to make a livelihood, and sometimes not for pragmatic reasons, because it was wisdom, and everything you know about wisdom affects everything else you know about wisdom. So a person who wants to truly perfect his mind needs to know a lot about everything.
It's kind of a Rambam approach.
Yeah, but it wasn't unique to the Rambam. That's what I'm saying. The Rambam happens to be more famous than average Rishon, but all the Rishonim of Spain and Italy, and before them, the Rishonim of, I mean, they're not famous for it, but certainly Spain and Italy is very obvious. All of them had a classical, what was the known science of their time, and etc.
Right.
And to a great extent, even among the Rishonim of Germany and France, this was true. The objection to higher education today is something that's, so there's no strategic objection. So that's what I'm saying. There's no value that it violates per se. But there is a value, there is a tactical objection, because in today's environment, very few people can get a significant education just by reading books on their own. There are people who do that, and there are people that I know personally that are brilliant mathematicians or brilliant physicists even, certainly very extensively knowledgeable in culture in general, non-Jewish culture, etc., having never attended an institution of higher learning, just because they are very well read. But those are rare people. Even for very intelligent people, outside of the environment of a place where they teach this, it's very hard to pick up the essentials of a field of knowledge. So, because you need to be in that environment to succeed, at least like I said, for the vast majority of people, and that environment has turned into something so toxic, they're against the idea because they don't feel that the toxic environment is justified by the need to pursue outside wisdom.
So you think that the advent of AI learning and teaching would make a difference?
Yes, I think it will make a big difference. Probably take a generation or two for us to see it, but yes, it'll probably make a big difference. And I mean, there's a famous story during World War I where a fellow approached Rabbi Chanan Wasserman with a halachic shaila that he had a son that was subject to the draft.
In what
which,
country?
you know, I'm assuming because it was Rabbi Chanan Wasserman that it would be in Poland. Poland would then be Russia, because Poland was, during World War I, was under Russian dominance. It wasn't an independent country. And, you know, it was something of a meat grinder. The Russian Tsar was throwing away thousands of Russian lives.
Then as now.
What?
Then as now.
Yeah. I guess it's something in the Russian personality. I don't know. But anyway, the Tsar was throwing away, you know, great numbers of Russian lives in a useless way. But regardless, this person didn't feel that he owed Russia, Mother Russia, anything special that he was willing to sacrifice his life for. He had two legal ways of getting out of the draft. One was, if he was a university student, he could get a draft deferral. I don't know if I don't know what the rules were in Russia in 1915, 16, whenever this was, but I don't know if he had to be a specific course of learning that the government valued, or if it was just all university. I'm not sure. I don't know the details. I didn't look up the history. Versus he could get a job as a worker in a munitions factory, and all the workers there were not subject to the draft because obviously the government didn't want to interfere with the production of munitions.
It's part of the war effort, of course,
Yeah.
yes.
So, but without the dangers of being on the front and going to the meat grinder. And the problem was, though, that the factory worked 7 days a week, and they would only agree to take him on as a worker if he would work 7 days a week, which include working on Shabbos, including doing malacha, et cetera, et cetera. The university, he would not have to violate Shabbos, but he would have to be in that university environment and taking particular courses of study, and et cetera. And Rabbi Chanan said that he's allowed to take the job as a munitions worker because going to the front under these circumstances, pikuach nefesh, and to save his life, he's allowed to violate Shabbos.
And that rather than going to the university.
But he said going to the university is kfira, and that's a hereg val yavar. And so even to save your life, you couldn't go to the university.
Wow, even though it's not actually him being kosher, it's just him being exposed to people.
Just being in the environment where that is, how do you call it? Because it's impossible for a person, to use the metaphor of Chazal, if you go to a tannery, you come out smelling like all the chemicals that they use in a tannery. If you go to a perfume shop, you come out smelling like a perfume. And so it's impossible to be in that environment and not have it affect you. And therefore he said, being in that environment is a hereg val yavar. It's better to go to the front and risk his life than to go to university. But to be a munitions worker that has to work on Shabbos, that's okay.
Wow.
Okay. So I have not actually researched the details of the story to be able to say this happened with this person at this place at this time, so I know the story is a true story. But I think it demonstrates a point whether the story is actually true or not. I think it is a true story, but even if it's not a true story, the fact that it's accepted as a true story says something about the attitude, and that's why I'm using this as a metaphor for a larger attitude, which is that if you live in an environment where people cannot live in a society where they are not respected members of society. Everybody, it's one of the most fundamental human needs. I mean, basically, after you get past starvation, even before you get past hunger, just once you get past starvation, the next need is to be accepted by your peers. Most people in the world, overwhelming majority of the people, would go hungry every single day. Again, maybe not to the point of starving to death, but hungry every single day to be accepted by their peers rather than, right? And if you don't think that that's true,
that's
there's an entire weight loss industry, right? That's based just on that. Make your life uncomfortable, unpleasant. I mean, there may be health reasons for weight loss and whatever, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the unhealthy weight loss, which is an entire industry that's making a lot of money off of doing that. And what are they selling? They're selling basically, make your life unpleasant and uncomfortable in order to be looked up to by the people around you.
It's interesting, that's not how Maslow put it.
Okay. Am I wrong though?
But what you're saying makes sense. But that is a bit of an overturning of that pyramid.
Okay, again, I don't think there are people who develop because of these things, eating disorders, and will literally starve themselves to death. That happens as well. Yeah. But that's relatively rare. That's only a small proportion of the population. Yeah. But there's vast numbers of the population that will make their lives unpleasant and be perpetually hungry to be looked upon positively by the people around them. So this is a very basic, the point is, and anybody knows this, I mean, any mashgiach in yeshiva is the first thing they teach you in Musar, it's the first how do you call it, that people cannot escape the bonds of their environment.
Right.
So if you can, again, there might be very, very rare people, there's an Avram Avinu that can be Kair B'Shem Hashem and a polytheism, but those are people, there's a reason why Avram is Hashem's chosen. He's a very unusual human being.
Yes.
But normal people cannot escape the bounds of their environment. So the way you deal with that is by carefully choosing your environment.
Yes, and that's that's obviously a. So
this is an example of that. Now, when I was in medical school, just for example, because I was there was 147 students in my class, my year, if I'm not mistaken. We started with 148. One girl walked into the gross anatomy lab the first day, saw all the cadavers laid out there. She said, "I'm not doing this, have a good day," and left. So as of the second day of medical school, we had 147 students. There were 2 guys that wore yarmulkes, which is myself and a friend of mine, and there was one religious girl. But a religious girl is much harder to pick out of a crowd because there's nothing that makes her distinct.
Obvious outward signs other than that she's not.
And then a third of the class was Jewish, but none of them were religious. Some of them had some minor connections here and there. Some of them had absolutely nothing to do with Judaism. They didn't know anything about it.
Which university was this?
I'm sorry?
Which university?
Upstate Medical College, which is a Sunni. There are 4 Sunni State University of New York. There are 4 Sunni medical colleges, one in Buffalo, New York, one in Syracuse, New York, one in Brooklyn, and one in Long Island.
I've only ever seen it in writing, and it's CUNY. So I would.
No, CUNY is City University of New York, which is a separate system. There's also State University of New York, which is SUNY.
Okay.
So the CUNY system, the Sunni system, they're 2 different university systems. So I went to the Sunni in Syracuse, to that medical college. But there were obviously among the non-Jews a certain number of people that were religious Christians. I'm trying to remember if we had anybody that identified other than Jewish or Christian. I mean, there were a number of people who were 2nd or 3rd generation Indians from India, but I don't think any of them were practicing Hindus or any one of the other religions They were all very secular. They didn't have any overt. So I think there were a couple of practicing Christians, a couple of practicing Jews, but literally a couple, 3 practicing Jews. And I don't know the exact number of practicing Christian, but it was very small. I mean, if you look at, let's say, the size of the student clubs, right? There was a Christian student union or whatever it was called, the student club, and it was less than 10% of the class had any interest, right? I think actually the Jewish student club had more because a lot of the irreligious Jewish students still like to come to the club and be part of the club, even though they didn't practice. Yeah, whatever. We try to make it a little bit more meaningful than that. But yeah, but we're interested in sort of hanging out in that environment. The point I'm trying to make is that it was very hard to go through medical school and maintain a sense of being secure in who you were if you were religious. It was a challenging thing. Nobody came over to you. It wasn't the Soviet Union. There were no mandatory classes in atheism. Right. A friend of mine, when his mother passed away, it's actually a relative of mine, when his mother passed away, he was at her shiva showing her transcripts from the Soviet Union when she got them translated into English to come to the United States. And so one of the transcripts, one of the courses, there were mandatory courses in atheism. Scientific atheism was a mandatory course that everybody in the Soviet universities in her day had to take. So there wasn't such a thing when I was in medical. There was nobody said you have to take a course in atheism, you have to come and we're going to try to convince you to be an atheist. But it was certainly in the water, so to speak, and it was very hard to maintain your sense of self in that environment. Myself, as a religious Jew, it was a little bit easier because every place I had ever been, if you're the guy walking around with a yarmulke, you're always the strange guy out. When I worked New York City EMS as a paramedic before I went to medical school, obviously I stood out because I wore a yarmulke. Basically every place you go, you're going to be. So you sort of live your life sort of being the strange guy, and everybody looks at you. He's a little weird, but that's okay, But if you're not ready to be that, especially if you're someone that attaches intrinsic value to the respect of your professors, it's a very difficult environment to maintain your confidence in who you are. Yeah. And we see that in the number of noshrim, the number of people that, depending on their background, these environments change who they are. And there's no, like I said, this is not because they become convinced of any great truths. No one argued with them, no one convinced them of any facts. It's just a sociological phenomenon. It's very difficult. Very few people can withstand the environment that they live in.
And it's also, it's also possible that the cause and effect are being reversed. And who are the people, the Noshrim, who chose to go to university because they wanted a way out?
The ones that I know personally, that was not the case. So it's anecdotal, but it's a fairly large anecdotal cohort, and that was not the case. Nobody said, in the United States today, in the modern Orthodox world, you don't need an excuse to go to university. You don't need an excuse to go to medical school. You don't have to have a special reason. I'm trying to escape from something to go to medical school.
That's just expected.
So it was. I don't think it was people that went there because they were looking for a way out. It was people who went there because they wanted to be physicians, but the environment caught up with them.
Right. I can see. Obviously, that's there's no question that the environment has an effect on people, but and I guess
and that was, I'm assuming, what Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, just to bring like my personal experience over here with my daughter, who was in SEM at the time, and she wanted to become a psychologist, and she consulted with the Rebbeim at the SEM, and they said, like, under absolutely no circumstances, it's the most terrible thing. You shouldn't get into that. There's kfira and whatever. And we said, let's talk to some other people. And we spoke to Rav Avram Tversky Zatzal, and he spoke to her, and he said to her, if we don't have from people studying psychology, then we won't have any from psychologists. And this is what he said to her. And he said, look, you're a strong girl. She was, and she still is. I
have a daughter who's a psychologist, so I can't say anything negative about letting one's daughters become psychologists.
And she so on the strength of this, and also consultation with Rav Zev Leff,
there are certainly individuals for whom community-wide policies are not. In other words, policies are made for very large groups, and individuals. In other words, and they're the policies that are best for the large group, but there are individuals for whom they are not the best thing. And it's good that we live in a world where people can be individuals and they don't have to be only part of the group. But if you're talking about what works for groups, it's definitely true that be willing to put yourself routinely in that environment is very harmful.
Right.
But the point I was trying to make, though, is that it's a tactical decision.
Yeah.
It's not saying something about learning these things per se.
Right.
It's saying that in the world we live in at this particular moment, the way you would have to learn it is to put yourself in a particular environment that's very harmful.
Right.
And that's not worth it.
Tactics will also vary from situation to situation, where like my daughter or your daughter might be somebody, okay, you should go and study psychology.
It might. And if you have, let's say, somebody who would become resentful because they were unable to, because they were held back from doing something, and that resentment would do much more harm to them spiritually than the environment, then you're weighing, a smaller danger against a greater danger. I always, as a physician, I always thought it was very strange when people tried. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but there are certain mental illnesses in which smoking is almost universal, and there seems to be something about that mental illness that makes smoking very helpful to their mental state, whatever the chemicals in smoking are. So I don't go into the details, but there are certain anybody who knows things about these things will recognize what I'm talking about. There's certain mental illnesses in which virtually 100% of the people that have these mental illnesses smoke. Now, I'm imagining that these mental illnesses existed before people outside of the Americas knew about tobacco. So I'm imagining, 500 years ago, 600 years ago, people had these illnesses and weren't smoking. But once they discovered that there was such a thing as you could burn tobacco and inhale all kinds of chemicals by doing that, it became it did something positive for people that were suffering from these certain mental illnesses. And there are people who have this sort of universal view that smoking is bad for you, which it is. It harms your lungs, it harms your heart, it increases the risk of stroke, all kinds of bad things it does to your body. And so they're trying to convince these people not to smoke. And you have the same issue with, let's say, smoking in prison, where prisoners, for whatever reason, have a very high rate of smoking. They live in a very, very stressful environment, obviously, and they find that smoking helps them deal with it. And you have, like in the United States and many other countries now, people who do-gooders who decided we're going to ban smoking in prisons, right? So to deprive these people of the cigarettes. And without going into details, every situation is obviously different, so you can't say a universal rule, but in general, the people who are doing these things are extremely foolish and short-sighted. Mm-hmm. Because the people who are living in prison are much more at risk of dying of violence than they are of dying from the secondhand smoke, because the guy next to them was smoking, okay? And therefore, the idea that we should deprive their very grouchy mass murderer who sleeps next door to them of his cigarettes, because that will prevent him from getting secondhand smoke and having a slightly increased risk of getting lung cancer in 40 years from now, but will very much increase the risk that guy's going to take a knife and stab him to death now.
Don't forget the carbon footprint.
What? The carbon footprint. I mean, it's not dealing with reality as it is. And the same thing for psychiatric patients that are sometimes at very high risk of suicide and many other very self-destructive behaviors, and that are being maintained to some extent in their equilibrium by being able to smoke. The fact that we're worried that somewhere down the road they'll increase the risk of getting a heart attack or a stroke or whatever it's a very silly way of weighing the pros and cons. Again, it depends on the person, depends on the situation. I'm not saying a universal rule that we should never be smoking, whatever.
That it's a good idea to have klalim and to have general
so
rules.
It's good to say that smoking is bad, and we should try to do whatever we can to make as many people as possible not smoke, but to realize that there are people for whom the harm of not smoking is much greater than the harm of smoking, and we should let them smoke.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is true with this. The harm of this environment is great, and so in general, we discourage it, but it is true that there are people for whom the harm of discouraging it would be greater than the harm of engaging with it, in which case they should engage with it.
And furthermore, there are people who won't be harmed by it.
I don't think there's anybody who wouldn't be harmed at all, but relatively speaking, there are people that are more vulnerable and people that are less vulnerable.
And the benefit outweighs the risk.
Yes, that could be, again, so that's why these things are always very much individual decisions. And there are always going to be people who are going to go outside the mold, but the community's attitude is that this is a bad thing, which, by the way, is being done a tremendous self-sacrifice. Because when you think about all the people, all the really brilliant people that you know, that I know, that are shopkeepers and could have been, professors, and deliberately made the choice not to put themselves in the environment that would allow them to become a professor and to remain a shopkeeper all their life with all of the economic and social repercussions of that, because they felt it was spiritually better for them or better for their children or etc. That's not a small thing. We have to appreciate what's being done here.
Absolutely. Can definitely
respect so but getting back to your original point, there's a difference between tactics and strategy, and this is a tactical decision. Sometimes, like I said, a tactical decision can become so big that it takes on strategic significance. But inherently, it's a tactical decision. No one's saying that this is intrinsically the way God wants the world to be. They're saying in the world that we find ourselves, this is how God wants us to behave.
Right. So in terms of the split between, let me rephrase that. There's what we've just been describing is like internal policy. Like, what do we tell our people, and what's the best way of life, and how do we avoid undesirable influences in our society? And that part is understandable. I think what I really want to dig into is the, I guess, there's a spectrum of views, obviously, but like it ranges from at best ambivalence to at worst outright hostility to the state. And I can understand, obviously there's a lot of history and a lot of bad blood, and let me bring to a comment that I saw from one of the Israeli journalists in the last couple of days, saying, look, if you take a look at every sector of Israeli society, they've all got their own plan for how they think Israel should be run. Right? You ask Smotrich, and he'll say, no, you should do things like this, and that'll make an ideal society. You ask Yair Golan, and he'll say, you've got to do things like this, and it will be an ideal society. But if you go to the Haredi leaders, they don't have a plan. And is it because they don't see themselves as part of Israel, or that they're not saying like, how you should run the country, you should do it like this, and give. There's no constructive suggestion. It's always just, no, we won't do this. No, we won't. We won't cooperate with this. We just leave us alone. And
that is a very good point. I think it comes from two places. Actually, I would say I know it comes from two places.
Yeah.
And it's not a speculation. Number one is that they feel that there are many things, the leadership, the intellectuals, the gdolim, the people, the thinkers, the people who people follow, think that there are things that there really is no answer to them. And so we do often find ourselves in life in situations where there is no right answer. So you say, I will just live the way God wants me to live and leave it up to him to fix the larger global politics. We look back now at mutually assured destruction, which was sort of the strategic doctrine, idea, yes, right, of the Cold War, as brilliant because it worked.
Yeah.
We would think about it very, very differently if one day Brezhnev had just woken up in a bad mood. If unknown to anybody, he had started to get a brain tumor that affected his judgment.
Or you had a Dr. Strangelove scenario.
Whatever. And now, we were living in basically the level of society. We were living in the Middle East in the level of society in the 1500s, in terms of technology. And most of North America, Asia, Europe was just the smoking ruins. We were thinking, maybe mutual assured destruction was really not the way to go. It was a very, very risky policy because it only works if the other side is absolutely convinced you're really going to do it.
Yeah.
And you're only going to convince them that they're actually really going to do it if you really will do it. And if you really will do it, we really could have burnt up basically the whole world, and find ourselves. So there are times when there is no right answer. So what should we have done? Should we have let the communists dominate the world? We couldn't do that either. So there really wasn't a good answer. Okay, so sometimes you say there really isn't a good answer, and we're just going to pick the bad answer that we think God prefers for us. And therefore we're not going to make pronouncements about whether or not we should engage in mutually assured destruction or we should surrender to communism. We're going to say we really don't know. So we're not saying anything. And there are issues like that, many issues like that in society today. And there's nobody with broad enough shoulders to be able to say, this is what we should do. So they say, okay, then we're not making any suggestions. Yair Golan, I personally think, is a fool. Not just because he believes in such foolish ideas, but because he doesn't realize his own limitations. The cost of his ideas, what happened on October 7th was just a down payment of the price we're going to pay for the expulsion of the Jews from Hevel Aza.
Yeah.
Right? And militarily, economically, politically, we've just begun to pay off that debt. And people like Yair Golan totally don't realize this. Like, reality is staring him in his face, and he totally doesn't realize he wants to do the whole thing, same thing over again. So in terms of his policies, I think he's a fool. Doesn't mean he's not a brave man or a man that was a tactical genius on the battlefield. I don't know whether he was or he wasn't. I never served under him. But he's a fool because when he goes outside of his immediate area of expertise, he believes many, many foolish ideas. But he's a bigger fool for thinking that he could know these things, for not realizing his own limitations, for not saying, you know what, there's things in the world that are way too complicated for me to have an opinion about.
Sort of demonstrating the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah. And I mean, listen, I've read up a fair amount of Einstein's papers. Einstein believed a lot of political ideas that were pretty stupid too.
Actually, don't know about that,
okay. Okay, that doesn't mean anything. He was a brilliant physicist. He had a good mind for physics. He knew a lot about it. He spent a lot of time on it. Apparently, he didn't know a lot about politics, didn't understand it very well. Maybe he didn't know a lot about human nature. He didn't understand how people behaved. You could be brilliant at understanding how atoms behave and very foolish about understanding how people behave.
Yeah.
And then you can have a lot of really bad political ideas or be easily suckered into bad political ideas. So what I'm saying is you can be brilliant about one thing and very foolish about another thing. that doesn't make you a fool per se, but when you don't realize your limitations, that's when you become a fool. When you think, because I'm a brilliant physicist, therefore there is meaning to my political speculation, then you're a fool.
That's like the whole of Hollywood, basically. So just because you're good at acting doesn't mean that it makes you a moral.
Right. You don't even have to be good at acting just because you have a pretty face, and maybe some acting talent. It doesn't make you an expert on anything. That's true. But there, I think people recognize that. No serious person thinks that the opinion of Hollywood actresses should be taken into account for anything. But it's not as obvious, not as self-evident that the opinion of an Einstein shouldn't be taken into account for political questions.
Because he's obviously got genius IQ.
Feynman, who was quite a bright guy and very anti-clerical, is quoted as, again, I wasn't there, but he's famously quoted as having said something to the effect, I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect of, on the other hand, what do I know about religion? In other words, acknowledging that just because I'm a smart physicist, and therefore I think that all kinds of theology is foolish, doesn't actually say anything about theology, because I know nothing about the subject.
Right.
So he was a person who was not a fool. I wouldn't agree with him about theology, but at least he had the insight to realize he doesn't know anything about the subject.
Right.
Okay. But others, not. Anyway, so the question you're asking. So the Haredi world, I think, very much recognizes its limitations. The thinkers of the Haredi world very much recognize their limitations. And they recognize that there were things about which the Chazon Ish could make pronouncements because he had broad enough shoulders and enough insight and enough ability to foresee the consequences, not just a generation, but 2 or 3 or 5 generations down the road, the policies that he was setting in place. So he could make pronouncements. And the people that are in the leadership positions today feel, we don't know what the consequences of a particular policy will be in 3 generations. We don't have the wisdom to predict that. And so we're not going to say things about that. We're going to stick with what we know and not make pronouncements about what we don't know. That's one reason, and that's definitely true. But I don't think that that's the whole truth. Another part of the truth is that in the back of everybody's mind is the idea that, now we're not talking to pronouncements in general, we're talking about specifically as regards to the state of Israel. The state of Israel's been around for only a couple of years. Like, from a historical perspective, it's a very, very new phenomena. And as much as it's emotionally painful for us to face this fact, there is no reason to believe that it's going to last much longer. In other words, if we design our worldview around the assumption that there's always going to be a state of Israel, and we're going to design policies that will affect 1, 2, 3, 4 generations from now, based on that, and yet it's entirely possible that there won't be a state of Israel in 2, 3, 4 generations from now, then it seems a very foolish way to invest our efforts.
That's quite a shocking statement. Because, okay, even if you admit the intellectual possibility that the state of Israel...
Emotionally, it's very difficult.
Okay, emotionally being difficult, but just being able to accept with equanimity that, it might not exist, and who cares?
I don't know who cares. Who cares is a different question. Whether we do care, we don't care, how we care about it, what the effect... But caring is an emotional response. I'm not going into that. I'm saying how you design policies is not about what you care about.
Are we saying that the leadership would prefer to have a state of Israel, or would they prefer to be under Islamic
I don't know.
caliphate?
No, not necessarily. Those may not be the only possibilities, but I'll give you a simple example, something that I mentioned to somebody else in a different context, but I think it sort of demonstrates a larger point. In the 1970s and 80s, there were all these jokes about that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, when he took the Jewish people out of Egypt, he made a wrong turn. He meant to turn towards Saudi Arabia, and instead he turned towards here, right? Because it was so obvious that Israel was such a resource-poor country with neighbors that were so resource-rich that it was why want to make your country here, right? And then a fascinating thing happened. Roughly 20 years ago, a little bit more than 20 years ago, they began to discover natural gas and began to successfully extract natural gas, a little bit of oil also in a couple of places. And now, theoretically at least, Israel's an energy independent country. Because of maybe some foolish government policies, it's not in practice actually an energy independent. But in theory, it could be tomorrow morning an energy independent country. And that changes everything. All those jokes are not funny anymore, right? But imagine somebody who said in 1980, on the basis of the social attitude that those jokes represented, that I'm going to put in place policies that are going to affect future generations for another 100, 200, 300 years, based on the assumption that the state of Israel will always be a resource-poor country.
Okay.
He would have been doing something very, very foolish and very harmful, because he was working on assumptions that turned out not to be true.
But I mean, you have to work always with the information that you have at hand, and if new information comes to light, then you have to adapt.
So when you know that there's a very strong possibility of new information coming to hand, you very much restrict what you commit to.
Yeah. Okay.
In other words, you don't make policy based on this is the best information I have now, knowing that it's very likely that in 10 years from now, the best information is going to be very different.
I don't know. You can't be paralyzed by saying, well, I can't make.
You're not paralyzed. Not paralyzed. You have to know how. I mean, there's a whole science now. There's a whole field of endeavor that deals with how do you make decisions in moments of uncertainty, which affects business decisions and it affects health decisions. We do this all the time in medicine, right? We all know that most types of chemotherapy are very toxic and have all kinds of terrible side effects, right?
Right.
But we use them anyway because we think that the things that we're curing are worse, okay? Now, we do know that it's very likely that in 20, 30, 50, 100 years, there'll be much better techniques and we won't have to use toxic chemicals. We say, okay, but we're not making policies that commit us to what we will do in 100 years from now. We're deciding what to do tomorrow.
Yeah.
And tomorrow we have to deal with the resources we have available and not assume, even though we know that that's going to change over the coming years. Right. But right now, this is what we have available. So we're making a decision for tomorrow. And that's the same thing in medicine. You're always making decisions from a place of uncertainty. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but knowing what we do know, what's the best odds, right? Okay.
How does that relate to our situation?
But because if you change your educational system, you are not just changing something that affects what happens tomorrow. You can't change that back. That's irreversible. You've affected 3, 4, 5 generations from now by changing the educational system of today. The Chazon Ish famously was asked about a joint yishuv that didn't have enough children. It was a joint religious and non-religious yishuv. 1950s, 1950, okay? The early state of Israel, new yishuv, partially religious, partially not religious, doesn't have enough children to justify 2 schools. So they're going to, the religious and the non-religious children are going to go to school together. Now, in the school system where you have like the mamlachti schools and you have the mamlachti dati schools, that's a big chiddush because generally the religious children would go to the mamlachti dati schools and the irreligious children would go to mamlachti schools. But here you're going to have only one school. Right. So what kind of policies is it going to have? Policies that are going to be similar to mamlachti dati, that's going to upset the parents of the children who are not religious. Policies that are similar to a mamlachti school, that's going to upset the parent. So how do we negotiate this? So one of the proposals that was floated was we will hire religious teachers that will be the people who carry out the educational program, but an irreligious principal who sets the educational goals, right? Or the other way around, the religious principal that sets the educational goals and irreligious teachers that carry out the program. This would sort of be a compromise. And they went to the Chazon Ish to ask him which they should choose between these 2 options. The religious parents went to the Chazon Ish and asked him which we should choose between these options. And the Chazon Ish said, let them have irreligious teachers and irreligious principal. Just tell them you want control over what pictures we hang on the wall. Huh? Said, you hang pictures on the wall of tzaddikim, of great Jews. Because...
I did not expect that answer.
Okay. Right, neither would I. That's why I'm not the Chazon Ish.
Yes.
Okay, because the Chazon Ish's insight in his brilliance was, what you hang on the wall is what you value. Every day a child comes to school and they see a picture on the wall of somebody that looks like their great-grandfather, and they're being told this is an ideal. This is something you want to live up to. And everything the teacher tells them, and every syllabus developed by the principal, by the time they're 14 years old, they forgot what they learned in elementary school. By the time they're 18 years old, they forgot everything they learned in high school. They can't quote to you a single thing. But for a place in their heart that they couldn't identify themselves, they see a Torah Jew and they say, this is something I respect. This is something I look up to. And that doesn't change them. That changes their children and their grandchildren. So you've done something that is irreversible for several generations. And we know that the Chazon Ish was brilliant in his insights into education because he built the world that we see in front of us. That doesn't make any sense at all. When Ben Gurion said in 1949, he was both defense minister and prime minister, and there was this struggle within the IDF because whether or not the army should be kosher. One of the things an army does is feed its soldiers, right? Napoleon famously said, an army travels on its stomach.
Yes.
It's important to feed your soldiers, okay? And obviously, if you're feeding your soldiers, you have to decide whether you're feeding them kosher or you're not feeding them kosher. What's going to be the policy of the army? And there were people who wanted to feed kosher because they said there's a percentage of the country that's religious, and we don't want them to feel uncomfortable in the army. I mean, maybe they can bring a sandwich from home, maybe it's not practical, but forget about the practicalities. We don't want them to feel uncomfortable in the army. We want to feel that the army is their place too. So we need to accommodate them. And since you're not going to have two kitchens, a kosher kitchen, we'll already have two, right? Milk. Yeah. We're not going to have a third kitchen, pig. So let's just make it kosher for everybody because the people who don't want to eat kosher can eat kosher.
Yeah.
It doesn't harm. It's not against their principles, and the people that want to eat kosher, it is against their principles.
I'm surprised.
So we'll just make everything kosher.
Yeah.
Well, no, 1 second. That's one perspective, but the other perspective is we came here to create the new Jew.
Right.
And kosher is one of the main symbols of the old Jew that we came to eradicate.
Right.
So we cannot have that symbol of the old Jew in our primary institution for creating the new Jew. That undermines the ethos of what the army is supposed to be doing. Which is a legitimate argument from their perspective.
Yeah, if that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Okay, so I was saying, so there were the two schools of thought within the army. What should we do? We have to set a policy. We can't do both. They're conflicting policies. We can't have one base this way, one base that way. There has to be some sort of army-wide policy. Which way should we go? So Ben Gurion, who was a very pragmatic person, in general, that was sort of his thing. I don't know what his principles were, but the famous line goes, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others.
He was Groucho Marx.
Groucho Marx, yeah. So he was a very pragmatic person. He said to them, listen, this is a silly thing to fight over, okay? At that time, he didn't say this, I'm adding this in. At that time, roughly 15% of the country identified as what we now call Dati Leumi. Chardal wasn't yet a phenomena. Then it was Mizrahi. Which Chardal is socially very, very different phenomena. It was such a small percentage that it didn't even have like a number to be assigned to it. If we want to make up a number, we'd say 1%. So 14% and 1%. But basically it was 15% of the country that identified as Dati Leumi, what we now call Dati Leumi, then was called Mizrahi. And about 4% that I've identified as what we now call Haredi. 19% of the country. Okay? He said, listen, and the trend was that the overwhelming majority of children in each family, in each religious family, did not remain religious. The overwhelming majority, we're having this discussion in 1949, so if we go from the second Aliyah, from 1930 whatever, okay, until 1920s, the second Aliyah, 1920s until 1949, the trend over the last 30 years that he was familiar with, 20, 30 years that he was familiar with, was the overwhelming majority of children, overwhelming, I'm talking in excess of 90%, of children of religious families don't remain religious, right? I mean, you think about it, 1870, 1880, whenever it was, in Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, when these places are found in new agricultural communities, you see the pictures, everybody has a beard, everybody has long payas, their children, almost zero. Their grandchildren, zero. Okay? So this was the trend. And it made sense because the religious people were the poor, the backwards, the disrespected, the despised. Okay? Who wants to be poor, backwards, and despised? So when given the option to join the enlightened and economically more successful,
so
and
they were
etc.
very chilled about the fact, we'll tolerate them in a couple generations.
Exactly. He said, in Meir Sharm we'll have a little museum of a couple of very stubborn people that still want to have a beard and pay, so we'll have a little museum so we can go there to look at what our great-grandparents looked like, or by the next, it'll be great-great-grandparents as more generations go on. And so we'll maintain that little museum there, and there'll be a couple of strange people that we have to put up with. But society as a whole, he said, in, I don't remember, it was 15, 20 years, he said, no one's going to ask this question. No one's going to care about kosher in the army in 20 years from now. So why are you making it a big deal? Give the kosher people that kosher in 20 years, and they won't even be asking for kosher anymore. And it's not that Ben Gurion was wrong. Any reasonable person looking at the Netunim at that time would have agreed with him. The fact that this was sort of, again, obviously I'm a little bit oversimplifying because it wasn't just Ben Gurion and it wasn't just the Chazon Ish, but sort of if you want to take two dominant figures in these two pools, right? The fact that 50, 60, 70 years later, what Ben Gurion founded has completely lost its self-confidence. It virtually doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there are very, very few real secular Zionists anymore. Right. There are traditional, and there are secular anti-Zionists, or secular non-Zionists, very, very few people that Ben Gurion would recognize, right? And as a percentage of the population, it's not only a minority, but it's a rapidly shrinking minority. I mean, you see, the famous Kaplan, right? Kaplan is, it's well known, Kaplan is a place for elderly pensioners to gather and demonstrate against the youth. Yeah, I'm exaggerating. I'm sure there are some young people who show up at Kaplan as well.
Yeah,
but
lots of young people in Kaplan.
Right. But as a percentage, I mean, look at the demonstration on Thursday, Haredim demonstration, right? It was 100% people under 40. 200,000 people, 100% of them under 40. And when I say 100%, you can say, no, I know there was one guy that was 42. But basically, 100% of people under 40, okay? Yeah. I don't know if this is still true now, but a couple of years ago, just in a completely different conversation, happened to check the statistics. Beitar Ilit, 67% of the population under the age of 16.
Yeah.
Okay? Et cetera, et cetera. And these are not the numbers you're getting from Herzliya Pituach. So, this is the older generation versus the younger generation. But what I'm saying is, so the way things looked in 1950, it was obvious that the future belonged to Ben Gurion. It was obvious that in 20 years from now, this won't even be an issue, so why are we fighting about it?
Right.
In the army. And he was 100% right, and yet the Chazon Ish ran circles around Ben Gurion because the Chazon Ish was able to understand the effect of a policy in 3 generations from now. Yeah. That when I hang the picture on the wall doesn't change anything now. That same guy that went to the secular high school and gets drafted into the army when he's 18, he may eat the non-kosher food and he may do whatever and be Machal Shabbos, but he will have religious grandchildren because of the picture you hung on the wall. Mm-hmm. Because of the values that he will give his children and grandchildren because of that picture.
But I mean, let's
okay. So coming back to the issues at hand now, there are many people who say, listen, the state of Israel is a temporary aberration. The new Jew, this idea that there was going to be a new Jew, is not going to pan out. Well, the new Jew has lost his self-confidence. He doesn't want to be a new Jew anymore.
That's not even under discussion.
Right, and therefore the future belongs to the old Jew. As much as people will get together every Motzei Shabbos on Kaplan to beat their chests in frustration over the fact that the future belongs to the old Jew, that is the reality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Given that, doesn't the old Jew now have a responsibility to?
No. Yes. Eventually, yes. But at this moment, because we don't know what the future will bring, and we are not the Chazon Ish, and we don't know the effect, the irreversible effect of this or that policy in 3 generations from now, we are going to say we are continuing to do what we were doing. It works until now. We're not deciding for anything else.
Okay, but then you're advocating for paralysis, that because we will never reach the heels of the Chazon Ish, nobody will ever be able to make a big policy decision.
You and I are not the first people who have said this. All the Gedolei Yisrael have said this many, many times, that we are stuck in paralysis, that we do not have a way to dig ourselves out of this, and we are in a circumstance where we can't foresee the future.
On a runaway car that's heading for a cliff. And
we don't know if it's heading for a cliff or not. That's the point. We don't know whether or not it's heading for a cliff. We have absolutely no idea where it's heading. We're on a runaway car that we have no idea where it's heading. And we don't know if what's behind us is worse than what's in front of us, or what's in front of us is worse than what's behind us. And therefore, we are taking no action. We are leaving things as they are. And they recognize, all the Gedolei Yisrael recognize. I've heard Gedolim say this to me personally in conversations. I didn't ask them these kind of questions, but it came up in other kind of conversations, that we do not know, we cannot know, and so therefore Sheva al Tasa Adif. We'll let God figure it out. And to me, what that says is, it would be like the equivalent of somebody in the 1980s trying to make long-term policy, assuming that Israel would always be energy dependent, and not realizing that 20 years later it would be energy independent.
So, I mean, what we're saying is, we know...
You're saying we're in a car heading for a cliff. We don't know that we're heading for a cliff. We actually have absolutely no idea. We're on one of those, like, how do you call it? Like you have in Disneyland, roller coasters that goes through like a dark mountain where you can't see anything of what's ahead of you, and you have absolutely no idea what we're heading for.
We're already off the cliff, is what I'm saying. Like, when you have an October 7th situation, and not just October 7th itself, but in the 2 years following October 7th, when you've got like the Dati Leumi and the Chardal public who are going and literally putting their lives on the line, and like coming home all too often in body bags, and you have a Haredi public that says, not our problem,
not
deal
our
with
problem.
It yourselves.
Not our problem. It is our problem.
But we're not going to do anything about it.
But we're not going to do anything about it, because sometimes doing something about it is worse than not doing something about it. In other words, if someone has a brain tumor, that in order to remove it from their brain, it's very bad to have a brain tumor. It causes a lot of different kinds of harm, even if it's not metastatic. Even if it's just a space-occupying lesion, just a space that it occupies within the skull, causes a lot of harm. And you're getting seizures, and they're getting all kinds of bad things because of it, okay? But you know that in order to remove it, you're going to kill them. So you're going to say, it's not that I don't think having a brain tumor is a terrible thing. I think it's a terrible thing, and it's causing all kinds of horrible things, but I'm still not going to take it out because I can do worse. Because being dead is final. So it's sort of the same idea, saying it's absolutely a lot of very, very painful and difficult things are going on. And it's not just painful and difficult things that are happening to another world. In other words, Hamas is not particularly picky. If they were to win the war, they would kill everybody. So it's not as though they're the enemies of secular Jews, but not the enemies of Haredi Jews. There may be a very small contingent who actually believes that the Haredi Jews could make a peace deal with them, but that's a very small contingent. That's not the mainstream. Mainstream feels that if Hamas ever won, Hezbollah, whatever, they would kill everybody. So it's not as though it's their problem, it's our problem too. We also don't want them to win. But by our, I don't mean me, I mean our, I'm talking in their name. It's not that it's our problem. But we also know that there are things you can do that are worse. We can cause greater harm by undermining our spiritual principles. And by the way, it's not just them who feels that way. There are many people in the Chardal world that feel that way as well. The way the agreements, the legal agreements between the hesder yeshivas and the government are written is such that if the government decides to shorten the yeshiva time and call the people that are supposed to be learning yeshiva back to the army, the government has the power to do that. That's the way the agreements are written. But there's another thing called hesder Merkaz, named after Merkaz HaRav, where they founded a separate hesder system, where they wrote the contracts with the government differently. And there, the government cannot override the yeshivas to pull people out of the yeshiva. So during this war, the government approached the yeshivas and said, listen, we need these people. We can't legally force them out of the yeshiva because the way the agreements were written with you, but we need them. So you cooperate with us and take them out of yeshiva. So they had a big meeting of all the Ramim and Rosh Yeshiva from the hesder Merkaz system, and they said, no, absolutely not. They're not leaving yeshiva. And these are not people who are anti-Zionists, who don't believe in fighting in the army, etc. But they're not leaving yeshiva in the time that they're supposed to be in yeshiva. Why? Because if they leave yeshiva, we will lose what we are fighting for.
Yeah.
It's not just enough to be successful in fighting, you have to maintain the reason why you are fighting. And we are fighting for a certain ideal. And we will lose our idealism if we don't give them the proper yeshiva education that they need. So they're not leaving yeshiva because in order to maintain our ideals, we need to be able to sacrifice other things. There are things, that, they're not saying it's not important. This is very important, but there are things that are even more important. And these were people, like I said, I mean, they're Haredim in terms of the definition, the way I use it in my book, but they're not sociologically Haredim. They're not people who don't believe in the state of Israel. And they're not people who otherwise don't serve in the army. But they understood that as important as this was, there were other things that were more important. So the Haredi world is taking that same position, but a little bit further. Now, I'll tell you what it really depends on, to my mind. It depends on whether or not the state of Israel is a Jewish state. And this, to a listener, may be a difficult thing to understand because the state of Israel calls itself a Jewish state. Like, what more can you want than that? Actually, it doesn't really. In other words, it's a common parlance. I mean, it's called Medinat Yisrael, and so I guess. But it doesn't, in any of its founding documents, define itself as Jewish. It doesn't even define exactly what being Jewish is.
It's a very sort of religion-neutral kind of...
So it doesn't define itself. For instance, there's nothing constitutional, there's no constitution at all, but there's nothing in terms of the laws of the state of Israel that says that the government has to be Jewish. I mean
like America as well. Just we spoke earlier about separation of religion and state.
Right, but in Israel they don't have separation of religion and state. There is a state religion. There's actually a bunch of state religions in Israel, but there is not separation of religion and state.
What do you mean that there's no...
There's a chief rabbanut, which is an official government organization, and then there's the Qadi, who runs the Muslim courts, which are recognized by the government and paid for by the government for Muslims. And then there is a separate Christian, how do you call it? Christians don't have independent courts because that's not part of the Christian tradition to have separate courts. But the Qadi has a separate court system, a Sharia court system.
Did not know that actually.
Perhaps the same way a Jew that wants to get married or divorced has to go through the Rabbanut, a Muslim that wants to get married or divorced has to go through Sharia, through the courts of the Qadi. So there are actually several different state religions, but regardless of that, the point is there is no religion, separation of religion and state.
And again, it was kind of a pragmatic decision at the beginning that you needed to...
Maybe everything that was done in the beginning was pragmatic decisions, and most things that are being done now are also pragmatic, not ideological decisions. But the question is, for ourselves, as religious Jews, we're asking ourselves, what is the definition of a religious state? What makes a state into a religious state? So if you say, well, maybe a state that has a lot of Jews in it. Maybe a state with a Jewish majority.
If you're going for a state that's governed by halakha, okay, we don't have that.
Okay, maybe that's the definition of a Jewish state. A state which constitutionally is obligated to halakha. That's the definition of a Jewish state. Maybe. Okay? If you want to argue that a Jewish state is a state that has a majority of Jews, so I would say, well, at the rate that Lakewood is expanding, it's not unimaginable that in a generation or 2 or 5 or whatever, that New Jersey will have a majority of Jews. Nobody in his right mind thinks that even if New Jersey has an overwhelming majority of Jews, that New Jersey becomes a Jewish state. It is probably true that if there was a majority of Jews in New Jersey, for electoral reasons, the politicians would take policies that were very friendly to yeshivas and very friendly to whatever within the limits of what the Constitution allows, right? But as friendly as they would be, it would still not be a Jewish state. Okay. So then the question becomes, okay, Israel is a country with a majority of Jews, that's true, but there's nothing in its constitution, again, I'm not talking about the technical, because there is no such paper called the Constitution, but there's nothing in its legal system, its traditions, etc., that in any way binds it to the Jewish people. There is the law of return. Even that's controversial because under the law of return, many, many non-Jews have come to Israel.
Right, because we took on the Nazi definition of
and also because we deliberately accepted many, many fraudulent papers in the former Soviet Union that we knew were fraudulent at the time that we accepted them, etc. Whatever the reasons are. But the point is many, many non-Jews have come to Israel under the law of return as well. So even that. But that's the only thing that's slightly Jewish about the state, in the sense that by an accident of history, Naftali Bennett, who was the leader of a party that had less than 5% of the members of the parliament, became the prime minister because he was a compromise candidate that everybody else could put up with, right? Abbas, who had the same number of seats, because Bennett had 6, but one of his guys didn't like what he did, so he sort of separated. So he ended up with 5, and Abbas had 5 seats. Theoretically, if he would have been the compromise candidate that everybody liked, if Yair Lapid would have needed some dental work at that time, Abbas was a dentist, so I think, pretty sure he was a dentist. He would have needed some dental work at that time, he would have agreed to Abbas being the prime minister. Then we would have had an Arab prime minister.
Yeah.
And that would have been perfectly fine in terms of the laws of the State of Israel, and even, one could imagine, socially acceptable to the people of Israel. A little machik lalechet, but not crazy.
Yeah.
Not out of the realm of possibility, and certainly, with the changes that are going on in another generation, we could imagine such a thing. So the question then becomes, right? And you have, let's say, for instance, the Supreme Court in Israel. Now, it's true that the Supreme Court in Israel has taken on many, many roles that have nothing to do with the Supreme Court, keeps arrogating more and more power to itself and authority, and etc. So it also has a legislative agenda, and it has other things that are. But one of the things that the Supreme Court claims to be its own values is to take into account Mishpat Yehudi. Now, it's not obligated by Mishpat Yehudi, but it tries to take the spirit of Mishpat Yehudi into account, right? But we've had on the Supreme Court a number of non-Jewish jurists.
Right.
Okay? So you come to a weird situation where the person who's deciding what the spirit of Mishpat Yehudi is someone that has not only no knowledge and no background in Mishpat Yehudi, but doesn't come from a culture that has anything to do with Mishpat Yehudi and is not himself Jewish. And that's considered completely acceptable.
Yeah.
Because that's the State of Israel. So I ask you, I may or may not have a definition for a Jewish state, but I could certainly see reasonable people arguing that Israel is not a Jewish state. There's nothing that makes it a Jewish state. It's a state with a lot of Jews, it's not a Jewish state. And it's no different than New Jersey if New Jersey had a Jewish majority. Now, does it mean we shouldn't care about the State of Israel? No, it doesn't mean that. If New Jersey had a majority of Jews, we would want, as Jews who care about other Jews, we would want New Jersey to thrive and have a wonderful economy and to be a safe place and a good environment and et cetera, et cetera. We would care about all those things. But we wouldn't care about it because it's a Jewish state. We would care about those things despite the fact that it's not a Jewish state.
Right.
So, very reasonable people could take the same attitude towards the State of Israel. That the State of Israel is not a Jewish state, and we care about it in the sense that there's a lot of Jews there, so we would like them to have a flourishing economy, we would like them to have a wonderful environment, we would like them to have peace, and we would like them to defeat their enemies, and et cetera, et cetera. We would like their enemies not to have the opportunity to kill them, but none of that says anything about it being a Jewish state. Now, why does that matter? Because if it's a Jewish state, then serving in the army, you are serving as a representative of the state. The obligation to serve in the army is your obligation to the state. You cannot say, it doesn't fall under the halachas, the laws of ahavta l'reacha kamocha or leisamar al dam reacha. It's a particular obligation to the state. And you can't push that off on somebody else. You can't ignore it in favor of doing something else because you have a personal obligation to the state.
Yeah.
Okay. Just like, for instance, right, when you sign a ksuba, you're agreeing, well, you don't sign. When the Adam signed the ksuba on your behalf that you're going to give to your wife, you're agreeing to support her. You can't say, well, next door neighbor's willing to support her. They have extra food they're always sending over, so I don't need to feed her. No, you can't. You have a personal obligation to support your wife, and you can't, even if it's possible that somebody else will do it, you don't have the right to leave it for somebody else to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is different than general obligations. For instance, if there was just a poor woman in the neighborhood who didn't have food to eat, you don't have a personal obligation. You have an obligation to feed her in the same sense that everybody else has an obligation. So if one of the other neighbors is sending her food, you don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
So it's very different, a poor woman that doesn't have food somewhere in the neighborhood versus your wife, where it's a personal obligation. And that's the difference between whether or not the State of Israel is a Jewish state, which you have a personal obligation to the state, versus it's a state with a lot of Jews and we care about them. But if somebody else is taking care of it, or I have more important things to do, like literally more important, not because I don't feel like feeding her, but because I really have things that are more important to do, then I will do those things. So if the obligation to serve in the army is v'hafta l'reacha kamocha, l'samar al dam ha'reacha, v'hashev v'yisilai. In other words, all the same obligations of serving in Hatzalah.
Yeah.
And all the same obligations of going to medical school and becoming a physician. And all the same obligations of doing all the other things where you help people and save people and whatever. Then you don't have a personal obligation to do it if you have something more important. Nobody argues that everybody who wants to work on Wall Street has to immediately drop out of their MBA program and go to medical school. Because what business do you have not saving people who are ill?
Yeah.
And nobody argues that every yeshiva bach has to give up learning and go join Hatzalah. Because we understand, we have rules, Chazal laid it out to us, and those are not the rules of Ahaftu L'Reacha Kamocha and L'Samar Adam Reacha. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a yeshiva bacher and you're on your way to hear a shir, and you walk by and you see somebody get hit by a car, that you don't stop to help them because I'm on my way to a shir, so I have to learn now, so I'm not...
Right.
Okay? Because then the obligation of L'Samar Adam Reacha takes precedence over going to yeshir. But if you're designing your life, will I patrol the streets looking for people getting hit by cars, which there are people who do that, let's say Mado or whatever, right? Or will I design my life so that I'm sitting in yeshiva and learning? I have every right to design my life, not only every right, but in many circumstances the obligation to design my life around sitting in yeshiva and learning and not around joining Mada and patrolling the streets looking for people that got hit by cars. Right. So, and if you're on October 7th and you happen to be near the border and you happen to have a firearm and you know how to use it and you can go in such a way that you're not likely to shoot your own people, there's a lot of ifs over here, or get shot by your own people, or etc. Okay, so you're part of an organized system and you know how to work with the system or whatever, then of course, even if you're a yeshiva bacher and your main goal in life is to understand the K'tzei Choshen, you still have to go fight. Okay? But do you have to design your life around joining an army and spending 8 months in basic training and then et cetera, et cetera? No, you don't. Mm. And not only don't you, but it would be the wrong thing to do. It's not what God wants you to do. So if there's somebody who says, but this is what's moshech me, I don't feel I could sit in yeshiva. I want to be going out and doing this. This pulls me for whatever reasons. So fine, there are people who feel a pull to go to medical school and help ill people, and there are people who feel a pull to go join Hatzalah, and Matavu Manam, and we pat them all on the back, and we call them tzaddikim, and we mean it. But we don't design the system for everybody to go join Hatzalah and for everybody to go to medical school. We design the system for everybody to learn yeshiva, because that's what preserves our ideals.
Right, I hear that.
Mm-hmm. So the crux of the issue, and I think any reasonable person would agree to that, the crux of the issue, because they themselves don't want to drop out of their MBA program and have to run to medical school, but the crux of the issue then is, what is my obligation towards the army? Is it a personal obligation to the state, because I believe that the state is a Jewish state and calls upon me as a person to participate? Or do I believe it's a state with a lot of Jews, and therefore there's all kinds of mitzvahs like and all the other mitzvahs of saving people's lives and doing chesed and whatever that obligate me, but there are rules to those. And I don't have to design, and in many circumstances I'm not allowed to design my life around doing that. I mean, think about it. There's also a mitzvah to be mesamech chosan and kala.
Right.
So except for the 3 weeks and part of Sfira, you could literally spend your whole life going to chasanas every single night, dance in front of a chasanah, do it l'shem shamayim, and if somebody did that, we would say, oh, he's being become a big mitzvah, but if somebody came to you and says, should that be my life? Abba, one of my children comes to you, Abba, should I do that? Should that be a meaningful life? I'm doing chesed every single day.
Well, I mean, if that calls you, man.
No, but
certainly not a
chiyuv. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So what we're saying is that to summarize that is that if your obligation is, if your attitude towards the state of Israel is that it's a nice place, it's good, and there are lots of Jews here, and we want it to succeed, but no, I'm not going to go and serve in the army because I think I can do better with my life in other things. And is there not better in terms of a personal selfish, but in terms of meaning? Because the cosmic meaning of my life will accomplish more if I sit in yeshiva and create the ideals that will allow Judaism to flourish for many, many more generations. And if you decide that, well, I'm not really cutting it out in yeshiva. I'm not a learner. That's a different story. So then it becomes a very personal decision, just like joining Hatzalah. Mm-hmm. If a bacher comes to Rosh Yeshiva and says, listen, I want to join Hatzalah because it pulls me. And if I don't do it, I won't be able to learn.
okay, then I can't speak on behalf of all Rosh Yeshiva, but from experience, having been in such circumstances many times, personally or with other people or etc., Rosh Yeshiva will say, okay, if this is something you need to do, then that's fine. So split your time half and half. Try to remain a Ben Torah, but you join Hatzalah. And the person says, I need to go to medical school. It's a Moshech Oti. You say, okay, you're an exception to the rule. That, again, the rules are designed for society as a whole. Within that, there are plenty of exceptions. So you're the exception, fine. But you have to ask yourself, will that harm you in other ways? If you go to medical school, will you come out of medical school as from as you went into medical school? That's a different question.
Right, it
plays a role as well. It says even if you have the right to leave yeshiva to go to medical school, but will you come out a good person? Yeah. When we say as from as you went in, what we mean is as good a person as when you went in. Because if you're not as from, you're not as good a person.
Yeah.
So if a person says, no, I know the way I am, I know that the kind of friends I'll make there, and I know that, and I will come out a less good person, and say that's a different reason you can't do it. That has nothing to do with staying in yeshiva or not staying in yeshiva. You can't do it because it's an environment that will destroy your neshama. And you don't have the right to do that in neshama.
And is it...
Which is another argument that has to do with the army. I personally have not found the army spiritually harmful on the net. In other words, when you weigh the pros out. But I certainly recognize the cons. I've been on bases, like I particularly have the good fortune to be in a battalion doctor for a religious infantry battalion, because it's the Bogrim of Netzach Yehuda. So the overwhelming majority of the people there are religious. And there's a minyan, and there's a very Torah-dik avira, and you can say Divrei Torah, and and etc. And there's at least no public Chil Shabbos, etc. But I've also been with other units. We're on a base of 250 commandos, when I was with a certain commando unit for 6 months. On a base of 250 commandos, you couldn't get together a minyan. There weren't 10 people with the army. There were 3 people who show up to shul Shabbos morning if we weren't on a mission. Shabbos morning, 3 people who we'd sit there and daven b'chidus. Okay? And that meant that there's people walking around smoking, talking on the phone. Talking on the phone might not be a malacha d'oraisa, smoking is. But it's certainly not in the Avira of Shabbos, and big screen, playing soccer, etc.
Yeah.
Okay? And I am somebody who was married, had children, had many, many Shabbosim at home before this, and will have many Shabbosim in the future, and didn't have to do this every single Shabbos, and etc. But I can imagine an 18-year-old, if he's not the strongest person in the world in terms of internal, how do you call it, doing this for 3 years straight.
That's going to affect you.
It's going to affect him. So if he knows that up front, again, like we said, you can't escape from the fact that your environment affects you. So the way you control that is by choosing your environment. So again, if you have a personal obligation to the state, you might say, well, my personal obligation to the state is stronger than my obligation to have to keep Shabbos, to et cetera, maybe, okay? But if you understand that it's v'hafta l'reacha kamoicha, and it's lesamar al dam reacha, and it's joining Hatzalah, then nobody who comes to a Rav and says, listen, I would very much like to join Hatzalah, I want to help people and this and that and whatever, okay? But I know myself that if I'm in Hatzalah and I'm driving on Shabbos for Hatzalah calls, I'll start driving on Shabbos to pick up milk, okay? I know my person, I know the way I am. Once I'm in that kind of avira and I can drive on Shabbos, I want to do these other things there. No Rav in the world would tell him, yeah, sure, join Hatzalah because you're doing a big mitzvah. You don't have the right. But what about v'hafta l'reacha kamoicha? What about l'samar al? No, you don't have the right to fulfill those mitzvahs if you know it's going to bring you to driving on Shabbos when it's not pikuach nefesh.
But I mean, when you do have frameworks now like Chashmonaim and previously Netzach Yehuda,
So,
I mean, is it not a desirable thing to make a framework for Haredim? That is
it is a very desirable thing. It would not, again, it's not going to be a thing for the average bocher in the mirror. Okay, that would not be the purpose of it. If that was the purpose, it will fail. But if you're talking about the average bocher who's in the mirror and doesn't want to be in the mirror, and wants to drop out, and this is not for him, and he wants to go to the army, and you just want to give him an environment where he will come out and still be from whatever, then these things are helpful. The army as an institution was opposed to them. They made Netzach Yehuda sort of because a few key people were interested in it, and they were powerful within the defense ministry, so they sort of overcame the inherent resistance within the defense ministry, but it was given a very limited role, and in most of its history, which is all of about, since I think, 1999?
Not sure.
Something like that, so 25, 26 years. During most of that period of time, it failed religiously. It failed in most of its missions. And that wasn't an accident. It was never given the types of resources that it needed. It was never given the right kind of, whatever. There were many people who were very, very, the fact that it didn't fail overall is because of the dedication of the people who came in. There were many, many people who were extremely dedicated and very much wanted it to work out, including many of the Magadim, the battalion commanders that didn't come from the Haredi world at all, but desperately wanted Netzach Yehuda to succeed and put in tremendous efforts. These are people that could have been on tracks to very prestigious things in the army and chose instead to do something that wasn't prestigious because they saw it as a mission, and their dedication overcame many of the negatives. But from a religious perspective, most of the time it failed. Okay, and even within that, the Amuta, which was made up of rabbis that were very supportive, obviously, they kept asking the army to expand. They said, what is today a gdud, a battalion, let's say 400 soldiers, 400 and something soldiers, we could turn it, if you gave us the resources, we could turn it into a brigade, which would be, let's say, 4 or 5 battalions. Okay, 1,000 soldiers approximately, roughly, okay? Maybe even more. 1,500 soldiers. We could do that. And the army said, no way. I was there during the during the meetings, because I was very involved with it. So I know that. The army said, no way, you will never be a brigade. We will never allow such a thing.
Never allow, not because
we
you
will
can't,
never
not
allow
capable,
such a thing. Forget about we won't give you the resources. Even if you brought the resources from Mars, we would never allow you to do such a thing. We do not want your kind of people in the army. And there's a good reason for it. I'm not saying it's not, I'm actually very sympathetic to their argument. Basically, their arguments are 2 things. Number one, somebody who thinks that the reason is in the army is that he's serving God is never a soldier that the army can rely upon. Because when he thinks the army's telling him to do something against God's will, we don't know that he'll listen to us. And that became a big issue in 2005. In the end, the vast majority of soldiers, there were some soldiers who refused, but the vast majority of soldiers, for whatever reason, gave in, including soldiers that believed that they were doing the wrong thing. They were peer pressured, whatever it was, and they gave in and they carried out their missions. But to the army, this was a scary thing, because the army says, we sometimes, the state of Israel doesn't only do things that God wants, it does things that God doesn't want, or it does things that you believe God doesn't want, that your rabbi tells you that God doesn't want. And we want to know that you're a soldier that follows orders.
Right, you got it.
So it's one thing to have a little unit that we can hide away in a corner someplace and keep them very far away from the hitnatkut or other types of things, how do you call it? But we're never going to allow a brigade that we can't rely upon, where we have a brigade. Okay, so we absolutely will not allow this to happen. Okay, that was one argument. And the second reason is they said, look, the army is essentially a secular institution, and the secular world is becoming increasingly progressive. We want a place where gays are respected, where women are considered equal to men or interchangeable with men. We want to, right, and that's why we're going to open up more and more things to women and lower standards in many places to allow women to be in places where they weren't allowed to be because they couldn't meet the physical standards, and et cetera, et cetera. We want these things because these are our values. And these are things that you demand that we withhold from you, right? We can never put a gay officer in Netzach Yehuda. We can never allow a woman onto a Netzach Yehuda base, all right? Well, there was a particular story where a very senior officer, a colonel, who was a woman, was made to wait at the gate. They wouldn't let her into the base. Guard, some private told her, no, I'm sorry, you can't come into the base, okay? So you're a woman. Sorry, that's it. That's our rules. Okay,
you're a woman.
Right. So they said, this is against our values. This is not the army that we want. We don't want an army built in this image. Again, if it's a little unit that we can tuck away in a corner someplace and sort of ignore its existence and it's just there for show, it's sort of Ben Gurion's museum in how do you call it? We can talk about, yes, we have a religious accommodation, and look, we have soldiers with payas, take a couple of pictures and then shunt you aside, but we're certainly not going to let you be involved in setting policy, and we don't want you to spread and change the social atmosphere of the army. So for those 2 reasons, both of which from their perspective were completely legitimate reasons, they said, we don't want you. It was a very mutual thing. The Mir said, we don't want our Bachram going, I'm using the Mir just as a stand-in for a Hadikah. Mir says, we don't want our Bachram going to the army. The army says, we don't want your Bachram coming to the army either. Okay, politicians will make some noise, we'll find a way around it. We'll make a demonstration project, we'll do other things, we'll tell the politicians false statistics, we'll whatever. We'll play our games, but basically, we'll let you do your thing as long as you don't come and bother us when we're doing our thing, and everybody will be happy. And that was essentially the way the army was until 2023, till October 2023. That was the attitude of the defense ministry.
Right.
Again, there were individuals who didn't agree with that. Elazar Stern, by the way, was one of the people who didn't agree with that. Because Elazar Stern is so ideologically Zionist, he was like, we have to do anything we can to get the Haredim into the army. And if that means giving them any kind of religious accommodation that they want, let's do it. And it means giving them more resources, let's do it. But he was an individual. Even though he was a powerful individual, he was an individual. In general, the attitude of the defense ministry, of the bureaucracy was, we don't want you here, have your little demonstration project and leave us alone. Something that compounded that was that more or less from 2016, okay, I'm giving it a date if you want to have a say, but obviously social trends don't have a particular moment when they begin. The army had decided that it wants to be small and smart. Maintaining a large army takes resources. The more soldiers you have, the more people you have to feed, et cetera, et cetera. The more soldiers you have, the more expensive it is.
Right, and I never think they would be involved in a conventional
war
again.
Well, there was part of it was we won't be involved in a conventional war, and part of it is that technology is much more important than soldiers. Okay? One F-35 with one pilot dropping one guided bomb can do more to win a war than a battalion of
foot soldiers, yeah.
400 soldiers with M16s or M4s, as the case may be, right? So we would rather have fewer battalions and have more F-35s. And it's not just F-35s, it's also the artificial intelligence that goes into creating intelligence assessments and et cetera, et cetera. But we want to focus on technology. That's where we want to put our money. Technology is expensive, and we don't have unlimited funds. We're not the American army that can just do everything. Even the American army can't do everything, but we're not the American army that can do a lot of things. We can only do a few things. We only have the budget to do a few things, and so we're going to take our budget, and the few things we're going to do is have a smaller army that's much more technological. It also comes from social pressures, because large armies depend on the ability to take large numbers of casualties. If you look at the Russian-Ukraine war, they're basically fighting World War I over again, with a lot of fancy things, drones and whatever, but at the end of the day, it's World War I with drones. And they are, to the extent that Russia is winning because it's willing to take enormous numbers of casualties. Apparently, Russian society is willing to accept that. I won't go into the social reasons why that's true, but that seems to be the case.
Well, they don't get,
Whatever the reasons is, we could say because the soldiers that are dying are coming from the Far East and the elites that run the country come from the West. Whatever the reason, I'm not going into it. There could be a lot of reasons why it's true, but the fact is that the Russian society is not going to revolt against the Russian government for killing X number of Russian soldiers in this, what seems to us like a meaningless war. Okay? But Israeli society is not like that. Israeli society is not going to tolerate a government that's going to kill a lot of Israeli soldiers. So when you move from soldiers on boots on the ground to technology, you not only you not only create a situation where one man in an F-35 can do the work of 400 soldiers, a 400 soldier battalion, but you also mean that you can only take one casualty. Even if his F-35 gets shot down, you lost one soldier. You didn't lose in a battalion of 400 soldiers. Who knows how many are going to get killed in the same kind of mission.
Right.
Okay. So all of these pressures were saying they wanted tzava, katan v'chacham, small and smart. And that meant that since you have a universal draft, you need to find ways not to draft everybody. Right? Because the law is universal draft, everybody gets drafted. But we want a small army where we're not spending money on soldiers that we don't want or need. So we need to find ways to not draft people. So you had this sort of conflict. In other words, no one said, oh, let's change the law and not have a universal draft if we wanted to. And by the way, I personally am in favor of the universal draft. I don't think it would have been a good idea to change the law for social reasons. But government has to weigh sometimes social benefits against what the army wants. So you want a universal draft, so the army starts looking for ways to get rid of soldiers. And many, many people, nothing to do with Haredim Haredi, are released for on the smallest of, how do you call it? Basically, you come in and say, I don't want to serve. They say, well, did you sneeze last week? Yeah, okay, medical exemption. Very adequate. The army makes no attempt. They're getting the elites in Herzliya and even parts of Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv, their children are bringing letters from psychiatrists that they're not
ADHD
stable enough, or whatever. I don't know I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know what you write on such letters. But whatever they're writing, the army knows that this is nonsense, and the army is happy to give them exemptions. No one's investigating it because nobody cares. They're like, good. That many fewer people that we have to feed.
Right.
Okay. And even so, there's a very large number of soldiers in the army that are doing nothing useful. Even with getting rid of as many as they could, they're still forced, because the lower classes, people want to be drafted. This is their ticket out of the neighborhood, so to speak. So they want to be drafted. They may not like the experience while they're in the army, but they like the idea of being in the army. And so they insist on being drafted, and you have to find all kinds of useless jobs for them. Again, where the army really has a shortage of is combat soldiers, which is only 30% of the army. And that's a generous definition of combat soldiers. 70% of the army is not combat soldiers.
Really? That high?
Yeah. No, that's actually low. I mean, in the American army, it's 80-20. Yeah, the American Marine Corps, which is fighter heavy, is 70-30. At least it was a couple of years ago when I checked the statistics.
What is 70% of these people doing?
When you, the different wars, different numbers come out. I mean, the people at West Point, that this is what they do, study for a living, these issues. But to have an effective army, you basically need somewhere between, for every soldier fighting, you need somewhere between 4 and 5 people that are doing other things to keep them fighting. There are people who argue that one of the reasons that the Japanese army did so poorly against the Americans in World War II was that the Japanese were very samurai, everybody wanted to be a fighter kind of society, and the Japanese army was sort of one-to-one. About 50% of the army was combat troops, and they said that worked out very badly for them. The American army was much more efficient because it was much bigger percentage of support troops.
Wow. Okay, that's an interesting stat for me.
Okay, so in general, like I said, the army, even today, has no shortage of soldiers. They have a shortage of combat soldiers.
Yeah.
But until 2023, from at least 2016, when there was a lot of emphasis on tzava, katan v'chacham, even combat soldiers, they didn't want too many of. That changed after October 7th. They found themselves fighting a very traditional land war. It was sort of Yom Kippur War type thing over again. And suddenly combat soldiers became much more important. It's important to keep in mind that as much as the army says, we've learned the error of our ways, and it's going to change back. The economic and social pressures that created the idea of tzava, chacham, katan haven't gone anywhere. So I don't know if it's going to take a year or 10 years, but the army is going to go back to that. The pressures pointing in that direction are too strong, right? Yeah. So this is a very temporary phenomena that they want more combat soldiers. But like I said, that moment, October 7th, really shook up a lot of people in the defense ministry, because things they thought couldn't happen, things they thought were stories from the history, from the parents and the grandparents, from the Yom Kippur War, from the Holocaust, will suddenly happen. These are things that only happen in history. They don't happen today in our lives. Were suddenly happening in front of them. And that undermined a lot of people's confidence, both in their military ideas, but also in their social ideas. They were suddenly open. They suddenly realized that maybe being progressive isn't the greatest thing in the world. Maybe having women in combat units is actually a bad idea. I mean, see what political pressure it brought on the government, the fact that there were female soldiers captured to Gaza. Imagine if this would be like the Yom Kippur War, where you had hundreds of soldiers that were captured on the Egyptian front, and certainly dozens more that were captured on the Syrian front. If they would have been women, what kind of pressure that would have put on the government to change its policies. So maybe it's not such a great idea to be integrating combat units, etc. Which the army had always really sort of, in the back of their mind, there were always gormim, there were always people in the army that realized this was a bad idea. And so there's always the struggle between the political or legal echelon that was pushing for this versus the military echelon that was pushing against it. But now people suddenly realize, you know what, we need a lot more men, davka men, and we need more men soldiers. And that was the push to agree to get the hesder yeshivas take the soldiers out of the part of their career term where they were supposed to be learning. Like I said, hesder, the regular hesder yeshivas didn't really have a choice. Hesder Merkaz refused to do it because they said then we're going to lose what we're fighting for. There's no point in winning if we win militarily but lose the war of the spirit, we have lost. And then people said, you know what, maybe we should, all this time that the Haredi Rabbanim in the Amutav Netzach Yehuda, now again, these are not necessarily mainstream Haredi Rabbanim, they're not Rosh Yeshivas from the big yeshivas. Some of them are from the big yeshivas, but they were invited to leave the big yeshivas when they joined Netzach Yehuda. But anyway, but they're not insignificant people, and they're very much, at least at the periphery of the community. We're talking about a community that's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the country, of the Jewish population of the country, not of the whole country, but 15 to 20% of the, no, I take that back, I'm sorry, 15 to 20% of the entire population of the country, which is a bigger, about a third of the Jewish population. So this is not an insignificant group. Maybe we should give them the brigade that they've been asking to us for all these years. And that was where Chashmonaim came from. It was the Haredim had learned a lot also because they had been double-crossed and betrayed by the army many, many times with deals that they had made with Netzach Yehuda and with other things. So it was written up completely different, and it was created to be something that it would have been the first true Haredi brigade that would have been in a way that the army couldn't undermine it. It wasn't really a brigade because the number of soldiers they started with wasn't big enough to call it, but they called it a brigade because that was their aspiration. They intended for it to be a brigade. Now, the army did two things, though, that even within this, they did two things to limit it. One thing they did to limit it was that they didn't make it part of the maneuvering army.
What does that mean?
So this is sort of, again, inside baseball talk. You have to know something about militaries in general and Israeli military in particular to understand the concepts we're talking about. I told you, most of the soldiers in the army are not combat soldiers. So roughly 70% are not combat soldiers, 30% are combat soldiers. But of the 30%, they're divided into different groups. I'm going to talk now about the real combat soldiers, which would be armor, artillery, infantry, the ones who actually go out and fight enemies, okay? Mm-hmm. There could be somebody, for instance, who mans an anti-aircraft missile battery, but does it from an air-conditioned office in central Israel. He's still considered a combat soldier because he shoots things.
Right.
But, there's a Iron Dome battery, et cetera, et cetera. These are considered combat soldiers, but they're not combat soldiers in the sense that
they're not on the front line.
They don't actually punch anybody with their fist.
They're engaged.
Okay, right. So we're talking about armored corps and the infantry, basically. Yeah. Artillery maybe a little bit, that you could argue whether or not, but let's say armor and infantry. So the armor and infantry, the army was forced by political decisions, not by political decisions from the elected legislature, but by political decisions from the unelected, self-imposed legislature of the Supreme Court, to open up many areas to women. And there were social pressures as well. There were girls who grew up, I want to be a fighter. My brother was a fighter, my father was a fighter, I want to be an infantryman. So what they did is they understood, on the one hand, they had to let women into the infantry. On the other hand, they understood how harmful it was to have women in the infantry for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it makes infantry much less efficient. So they created...
Well, when you're introducing male hormones into the whole thing, when you're starting to bring male hormones into play when they're supposed to be focusing on the battle.
Yeah, it's much more than that. That is true, but it's much more than that. It's much, much more than that. There's been many, many psychologists that have made a career out of understanding the group dynamics. If you get up to, I forget what the exact percentage is, but something like 5% females, it doesn't affect the efficiency of the unit. And you get over 5% for like every percent female you add, the efficiency of the unit drops by some noticeable percent. So that when you get up to like 50% female, you're really talking about a unit that's, in other words, you might as well have half the number of soldiers that you have in terms of what missions they can perform. So what the way the army sort of accommodated both was they created two different units, two different types of armies, if you want to call it that. They created infantry that are meant to guard the border, do certain internal work. In other words, what they call not maneuvering, not real wars. Okay? Glorified security forces. which had two benefits. Number one, the fact that they were less efficient as fighters was fine because they weren't expected to do any real fighting. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it took pressure off of the actual fighting units. So in other words, historically, let's just say, the border between Israel and Jordan had to be patrolled by somebody. Otherwise, terrorists would cross it all the time, right? So historically, let's say you would take a unit of Golani and they would sit on that border for 4 months. It was usually 4-month rotations, right? So they would sit on that border and they were basically wasting their time because there was nothing there that actually was relevant to the combat role of Golani. So they weren't doing anything in combat, so to speak. They were policemen, glorified policemen, patrolling the roads, right? And they weren't training. But that was sort of the cost of doing business. Somebody had to be there. So you wasted, from an army's perspective, you wasted 4 months. But then you could create units like Karakal, Arayot HaYarden, and other mixed units that could be as much as a third female. They're much less efficient. So they can never replace Golani in a war. But that was fine. That meant that Golani no longer had to sit on the Jordan border because you could put a mixed unit there. Officially, it's an infantry unit, so but they would never actually do anything that was real infantry, so to speak. And now Golani has another 4 months to train.
Right.
So it sort of worked out well for everybody, so to speak. And those were the units. So when they created Chashmonaim, they gave Chashmonaim the same status as Karakal, Arayot HaYarden, Bardilas, and these other units. In other words, they're officially infantry, but they wouldn't be part of the maneuvering army. Again, if you're an insider, if you understand what motivates infantrymen, whatever, you understand that it probably was not a good way to make it successful. The reason why an 18-year-old becomes an infantryman is because he's 18 years old and he's male, and he actually wants to do what infantrymen do.
Some action.
Right. And if you tell him, we're going to put you in a unit that you're just going to be replacing some girl because you'll rotate instead of her.
Why did I come here?
Yeah, exactly. You're not going to get a lot of motivation. But Chashmonaim did find ways around it. And Chashmonaim was actually founded simultaneously as a part of the regular army, part of the Sadir.
When was Chashmonaim founded?
Right after the war broke out. Soon after the war broke out. Less than 2 years ago. It was founded at the same time as part of Sadir, which would be regular soldiers that would do, how do you call it, and Miluim. And the Miluim actually ended up getting themselves a fair amount of action in Gaza and whatever. I don't know if you call it action, but they spent a lot of time in Gaza and whatever. This could have been, who knows, maybe it could have taken off. Maybe it could have become something. Maybe one day Chashmonaim would have convinced the army to make it part of the maneuvering army. And then it would have, that would have been a real historical change. But what ended up happening was that the politicians became scared of it. The same social forces that always came forth in the defense ministry and said, you're never going to get a brigade, woke up a year into the war and said, whoa, we just gave him a brigade. And that's going to undermine our values in the army. That's going to create a brigade that, for all the reasons I explained to you, that they didn't want a brigade. Now, these weren't like Haredim in the sense of these weren't guys leaving Panovich. There were a few, but there weren't many leaving Panovich to go, Panovich specifically, there were probably none. But I'm saying there were from that type of yeshivas to go to Chashmonaim. But there were more people from the periphery of the community, but people who had not otherwise served. Because two things changed on October 7th. One thing that changed was, I said, the attitude of the defense ministry changed because a lot of people had their confidence undermined. All the things they thought were true about the world, they suddenly found out were not true about the world.
Yeah.
That was one thing that happened. But something also changed in the Haredi community, which is the Haredi community was very comfortable as individuals with the fact that the army didn't want them. Like, you don't want us, we also don't want you, so everybody's happy. It's like a shidduch where both people are happy breaking up. Everybody goes home with a smile.
Right.
And it worked well for everybody. And after October 7th, like I said, the Hamas, the feeling was that Hamas is not being selective. They're not coming to kill. This is another Holocaust.
Yeah.
And they're not coming to kill only secular Jews. They're coming to kill everybody. And therefore, we want to be part. There was a certain kiruv levavot that happened in the Haredi community. It was more at the periphery, but it could have become a real phenomena, a real social phenomena of we want to be part of this, not because you want to make us be part of this, but because we want to be part of this.
Right.
So there was, at the same time that this defense ministry that suddenly became open, there was a tremendous push in the Haredi world, especially many older men that had left yeshiva years ago but had never gone to the army, so they weren't eligible for miluim, said, we want to be in miluim. We want to leave our wives and children and go away for a couple of months and fight for the state of Israel. Again, not as a state, but as a, how do you call it? We want to do this.
A lot of people in my shul, I mean, my generation, a little bit younger, like, volunteered for this kind of thing.
Right.
I tried and they told me I was too old.
Okay, but it was a phenomena, and it could have become something. What ended up breaking it, Chashmonaim now is basically a failed unit. What ended up breaking it was the miluim is sort of holding its own, maybe, partially. The Sadir, the part that was supposed to be part of the regular army, has crashed and burned. It's not really a thing anymore. What ended up breaking it, I think, was a combination of two things. The small thing was the part that it wasn't part of the maneuvering army, which affected motivation. I don't think that would have broken it by itself, because it started out that way, and in the beginning it was very strong.
Yeah.
So that alone wouldn't have broken it. Also, like I said, that could have been changed.
Yeah.
There were people that could have, you prove yourself, and maybe that would have changed down the road. And I think many people would have had hope. What really broke it was the draft law. When Lieberman and Lapid, basically, and obviously all the other politicians that agree with them, came forth with, we need 100% participation, we need shivyon benetel, everybody's going to be drafted, etc. It just became toxic in the Haredi community to go to the army. And I know, like, there's one person in our neighborhood whose son-in-law, who comes from a Dati Leumi background, served in a very elite commando unit as an officer, and then was transferred to Chashmonaim, which is the opposite of elite. Like I said, it's not even part of the maneuvering army, but because of who he was, because he was a guy that really, really wanted to build this as a national mission, and he's supposed to be a Samach Mempei, so like a assistant platoon commander. His father-in-law told me he sits in the army and does absolutely nothing, because there are no soldiers. They had a platoon that was supposed to start with 140 soldiers, started with 40 soldiers, because at the last minute 100 said, if there's a draft law, we're not coming. And they dropped out. And then I recently was just speaking to somebody who was in the Miluim in Chashmonaim. He said, yeah, it's empty. There's nobody there in the Sadir anymore. The entire apparatus is falling apart. Can it be saved? Can it not be saved? I have no idea. I'm not part of the Chashmonaim system, so I don't know, like, the real internal workings.
The way that you definitely.
But the observable facts, I'm aware of. I don't know, because the people who are pushing for the draft law have staked too much of their political capital on taking this position to be able to say, well, we want Chashmonaim to succeed, so we'll be quiet for a while. It's hard to imagine them doing that. I also don't think...
If what you're saying is true, that they actually don't want the Haredim.
So that's it. Well, no, there's different people don't want for different reasons.
Yeah.
There's people in the defense ministry that don't want because they don't want the challenge to their ideals. They don't want the challenge to the army culture. That's not necessarily the interest of the politicians. It might be a little bit, but it's not the main thing. I think the main fear of the politicians is that if let's say Chashmonaim would become successful, it would eventually become part of the maneuvering army. It would develop a reputation. It would become competitive. Netzach Yehuda became competitive because Chardalnikim started coming there. And it became something that Chardalnikim fought to get into, Netzach Yehuda. And then they put a cap of not more than 30%. And people are always trying to find ways around that cap and get in anyway. And most of the really good soldiers in Netzach Yehuda today are Chardalnikim, okay? Very motivated, very dedicated, etc. There could have been a mix in Chashmonaim between Chardalnikim and Haredim from the periphery of the community, and it could have become, like I said, part of the Tzava Matamren, and it could have, who knows what it could have become. But I think that the real fear of the politicians was that if that happened, what happens if it influences other people? Again, I don't know Yair Lapid personally, so I'm just using him as an example of something, that type of person. I'm using his name, but I don't know if this is actually true about him as an individual, but as an archetype. The scariest thing for somebody like that is for his son to come back from the army with payas and say, Dad, I had a Haredi roommate when I was in basic training. And for the first time in my life, I get introduced to Tanakh as Tanakh instead of as culture, literature, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I realized that you robbed me of my heritage. You sent me to schools that denied me knowing who I am.
Yeah.
Listen, I can understand it. But that's the ultimate fear. He much more fears that than his son coming home in a box from the army. And how are you going to prevent that when a third of draft age children a third of first graders in Israel are in Haredi schools? If you're going to forget about a universal draft, that'll never happen. The government doesn't have the power to enforce it. So it won't happen just because you can't do it. That's like passing a law against the laws of physics. You can pass the law, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But what happens if you get a Chashmonaim and then a second Chashmonaim because the Haredi community becomes so big that even 10% at the periphery of the community is big enough to build a few brigades? And suddenly you have these people being influenced, becoming an influence in the army. Again, the defense ministry being worried about changing the culture of the army, and the politicians being worried about, what about sending my son there? You know, Hebrew University at one time banned a certain outreach professional from being on their campus. I happen to know him personally.
Because he was too successful.
He's not a particularly Haredi person at all. He's not beard and payas type. Again, I think he has a little beard, but it's not beard and payas the way we mean it. It's a cultural beard and payas type at all. He's the kind of person that sits with the students and drinks beer and chats with them and whatever. But he opens them up to programs. They say, hey, he's a cool guy. He sits with us and drinks beer. And he says, you might want to try out this program. They're interesting or whatever. And students try it out. And this is actually, he's English speaking and is mostly reaching out to the American students that were coming to Hebrew University. So the American students who are coming to Hebrew University are basically from American reform or assimilated families, but that have a certain attachment to Zionism or to Jewish nationalism, etc. So they're happy for their son to take a year off from Harvard, Yale, whatever, and go spend a year in Hebrew University studying whatever nonsense. And this kid then goes to some program in the old city twice a week because he met this cool guy on campus and drank beer with him. And he says, hey, there's a really nice program, you'd enjoy this. And he goes to this program and he comes back to America and he says, you didn't teach me anything when I was growing up about what the Jews are, about Jewish history, about anything. I went for, twice a week for an hour in the old city, and I learned more about Jewish history and what it means to be a Jew than everything you sent me to the Reform Bar Mitzvah class or whatever. And I want to check this out. I want to go study with the Orthodox because they're the only ones who preserved our culture. And this is meaningful to me. And you denied me this. And parents started complaining. I sent my kid to Hebrew University. I didn't expect him to come back with a kippah. That's not what's supposed to happen when you go to Hebrew University. So he got banned from the campus. He ended up opening up a little shop across the street from the campus and whatever. And that's just an interesting anecdote. Yeah. But the point is that as much as that scares Reform parents in the United States who will send their kid to Hebrew University for a year, that scares the Yair Lapids. Again, I don't know him personally to be able to say actually. I'm using him as a dugma for how do you call it. And so there are many people who understand that the way to prevent that, maybe not this generation, but certainly the next generation, when the Haredi community is 50% of first graders, even the 10% noshrim on the side are going to be enough to be a huge factor in the army. That the only way to prevent that is to have a draft law that makes it so toxic for Haredim to come to the army that the only people who will come from the Haredi community are people who have become hate the Haredim, hate their parents, don't want to talk to anybody, and okay, he's not going to convince my son of anything, so I'm fine.
So in other words, what we're saying is that the draft law is intended to do exactly the opposite of what it says it's intended to do.
I certainly think so. Again, if every single person who signs on to the draft law, certainly the politician, in other words, if you're talking about some, naive demonstrator who believes what he reads in the newspaper that shows up on Kaplan Street, I don't know. Some of them are more sophisticated, some of them are less sophisticated. But you're talking about somebody that's been serving in the Knesset for a couple of years, that's been a minister, that knows how the game is played. And absolutely, they know what the law is going to do. And so presumably, it's one of two things. It's either they know that the law is going to wipe out the Haredi draft. Haredim will not draft it as a Haredi draft law. So that they know. So the question is that their goal? Or is the political benefit of demanding a Haredi draft law sufficient that they're willing to sacrifice Haredis, we won't draft them as long as I can get votes out of it? Or is that they're actually their goal? They say, I really don't want them to show up. That I don't know. And probably a little bit of both, and depends on person to person.
And it's and ultimately, the politicians' primary goal is to get votes next election. So
that's certainly something on their mind.
So if what they can do, and it works for both the anti-religious and the Haredi politicians.
Absolutely.
Because both of them can say, look, the other side is doing this.
I am certain that there are people in Mea Shearim who, we didn't even talk about this. This is, by the way, in the series that we do in my house on Friday nights, we'll get to this Be'ez Hashem. But there are people who, for maybe that they're not the mainstream, but they're not nobody. They're 20-30% of the Haredi community who believe that the state is Yehereg Val Yavar. Going to the army is Yehereg Val Yavar. Like literally, if Hamas is coming to kill us, still don't go to the army. Because it's better to die than to go to the army. Just like, let's say, I don't know, we wouldn't join the Papal Guard in the Vatican, even if that was the only way to save ourselves. I don't know if that's actually a good example. I don't know exactly what's demanded of people in the Papal Guard, but you could understand that there might be a circumstance in which something like that would be Yehereg Val Yavar, and they would say, even if you're going to die, don't go to that army. There are people who feel that way about the Israeli army. We'll talk about why. This is too broad a subject. It's not an unreasonable or illogical thing. It's just not the mainstream position. Those people, I think, after October 7th, were very concerned that the yeshivish community, which had started been moving closer and closer to their position, would move very much away. And I think that there are a lot of people in Mea Shearim that took a long, deep breath of sigh of relief when Lieberman came up with the draft law. And they said, okay, we're good. Nothing's going to happen now. As long as there's a law, we're good.
Wow, what internal sabotage of something that, that's unfortunately a way of cynical politics that actually works against the best interests of the country.
Shocked to find out that politicians are cynics. It undermines my... I don't know what it undermines. But yes, there's a lot of cynicism in politics. Okay, so that's, I think, sort of answered that specific question.
I think that does, and I think we've gone like super over time, but I'll probably split this up into a couple of separate podcasts so that it's bite-sized for people. Thank you. I very much appreciate it.
I hope that it was helpful, and I hope that...
I mean, for me, this is a very eye-opening discussion, and it really helps me to get into the head of what's going on in Haredi society. Because, even though I'm davening in a Haredi shul and whatever, I'm still a Chutznik.
I mean, this is something that really now we're not. I don't care if you put it on a podcast or not, but it's not meant as an answer to your question. But it is definitely true that the first generation Anglos are not Israeli in just so many different ways, but they never learned the internal workings of the culture. Just an example that has nothing to do with what we're discussing. Something that happened in this neighborhood, a very unfortunate story. A young lady that had mental health issues ended up committing suicide. She had been hospitalized in a psychiatric institution for a period of time, might have seemed to be doing somewhat better, was released to her home, and shortly afterwards she killed herself. Okay. Unfortunately, this is not an unknown phenomenon for people suffering from depression or whatnot to kill themselves, but obviously society and certainly their parents make a big effort to prevent that from happening. And of course, her father was devastated when his daughter killed himself, which was perfectly understandable. These are Western, like you and I, basically, America or wherever else they came from, English-speaking family. And he was one of the things he said was in his devastation, in his hurt of what had happened was, why did the psychiatrist release her if she was in danger of killing herself? So there are two things. First of all, psychiatry is not, that he doesn't understand. One is that psychiatry is not an exact science. It's always sort of guesswork and maybe guessed wrong, okay?
Yeah.
That's true. That's in general true of psychiatry. But there was something much deeper that he was asking, which is because that could have happened in the United States too, and he would have understood the system over there.
Yeah.
What he didn't understand is that the psychiatrist didn't make the decision. He made the decision. The psychiatrist was expecting, the psychiatrist says, I'm going to release your daughter. Now, an Israeli parent, okay, I'll take it from a certain end of the social spectrum because it's a little bit more dramatic, but in a different way it would have been true just as much from the other end of the social spectrum. If the father felt his daughter was not stable and could not be released, would have started screaming and yelling, "You will not!" And he would turn over the table and throw the doctor's computer on the floor, and have security would have to drag him out of there, right? And then the psychiatrist would say, well, I guess I won't because clearly the father thinks that she's not stable, so I changed my mind.
But being an Anglo,
but when you were being Anglo and the doctor said to you,
I trust you.
And you didn't have to say anything, but when he said, I'm going to release you, I'm going to discharge your daughter, and you were like, okay, if that's what you think. You thought, okay, if that's what you think, I'm just accepting your professional opinion.
Yeah.
But what he heard was, I, as the father, think that she needs to be discharged. You didn't think you were saying that, but that's what he heard, the psychiatrist. And if you came to him and said to him, why did you discharge my daughter when she was suicidal? He would say, because you thought it was a good idea. You know her better than me. You're her father. You thought it was a good idea. I didn't say it was a good idea. I have no professional opinion. I said I was going to discharge her and you didn't scream, you didn't yell, you didn't bang on the table. That means you said it was a good idea.
Yeah.
So this is where, just
Cultural
an example, has nothing to do with that, where you totally don't get the culture, you totally don't understand this. Now, I happen to be a strange person that is able to walk in many different cultures just because my personality or whatever. When I walk among the non-Jews, I understand where they come from.
Yeah.
When I used to have patients that were part of the Italian mafia, I won't go into a whole, how do you call it that,
okay, that sounds interesting.
When I was in the United States, and they would like specifically request me as their physician. Like one guy that used to call the clinic before I was still a student then. He would call the clinic. Is the Jewish doctor there? If I wasn't there, he wouldn't come. I understood them. Now, I wasn't part of the Italian mafia. I wasn't Hadico, but I understood their culture. We had a Safa Meshutefet. When they said something, I understood what they really meant. I got the joke, so to speak. And when I said something, they appreciated that I got them. And so they preferred a doctor that actually understood where they were coming from.
Yeah.
It's just sort of an extreme example, but it's true. So I work in Haredi culture, walk in Haredi culture here, and I daven with Yeshiva Haredim in Masas Mordechai. That's why I daven on the Shabbos morning, right? I understand them. I'm part of their culture. When I speak to them, I speak their language. I understand what they mean. And when I work with secular physicians in the hospital, I understand their language. And when I'm in the army, I understand the language of the army. When I actually, just because this is an interest of mine, to understand the psychology of how people work in these types of groups, when I go to, because of my rank and because of places that I've been and people that I know, I end up sometimes attending meetings of like very high-level people talking about interesting things. And I've had high-level commanders that considered me a friend and used to just like pick my brain just to see what I thought about things. And I would attend these things and I got it. I understood what was all the things that weren't being said in the room. But that's unusual. Very, very few people do that. Now, your children is different. Children grow up in the system and they become part of one system or another, but they get that system. When my son, who served in Netzach Yehuda, he was a Mak and then later a Memem in Netzach Yehuda. So he has like now, I don't know, 25 or 30 soldiers that have just recently been released from the army, but they sort of were his soldiers. So he goes and visits them and hangs out with them. And they made a Sudas Haidah for the day that they got hit by an RPG a year ago in Gaza, and they all got wounded, but not all, whatever. 8 guys got wounded, including my son, but thank God they're all okay now. But so when I go into the sukkah and it's all guys with, the, how do you call it, big knitted yarmulkes or the narei agvaot, and, the clean-shaven one, which is saying one kind of political statement, and the ones with the beards and the payas are saying a different kind of political statement, and et cetera, et cetera. And I talk to them and I joke with them, I understand them.
Yeah.
I'm part of their culture. And my son understands them, even though he's wearing a black yarmulke, but he understands them. He's part of their culture. Yeah. But most people will never do that. Most people are in the culture they're in, and that's the meaning of reality. And I don't think as sad as it is, I don't think the father of this girl will ever realize that the whole conversation happened with that psychiatrist, that he didn't understand what's taking place. And that's ma'afien, the way people are in general.
Thank you.
So I very much agree with your point that we are Westerners, and we totally don't get it.
Yeah, it's been very, very interesting, very insightful, and eye-opening. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Where life takes a spin. Join the fun, let the talk begin. Hakol sababa, where life takes a spin. Join the fun, let the talk begin.